The 2006 Volleyball Incident. I hesitated to make this one the first topic, since a lot of you that follow the conspiracy world will already know most of the details, but for the ones that don't know, basically, this theory speculates that in 2006, at a school or university, somewhere out in one of the western states, usually Nebraska or South Dakota, but sometimes also North Dakota, Utah, Oregon, or Montana, depending on the source, a spree shooting would occur which resulted in the deaths of around 20 people, and again, depending on which version of the story you hear, some of these were students, sometimes it was faculty. It all varies. Sometimes it said crime scene photos leaked online before they were found and erased. Others say it was worse than Columbine, while even others say that it was not a shooting, but a bombing instead. But the key point where the theory comes in is that the entire incident was completely covered up and hidden by the media and powers that be. This led to the word never getting out, as the public didn't talk about it, and the victims' families basically were told to shut up and be quiet about it. And just why would the powers that be do this? The main theories allege that it was either a psyops or, more commonly said to be, that of a training exercise for more potential spree shootings. Which brings us back around to the strange irony in all of this. If the entire incident was covered up, how come we know about it? That brings us to the first real weakness of this conspiracy. A secret covered like this would not be discussed so openly. Likewise, the shooting itself, according to its own conspiracy, would make more sense to be used in a way to change opinions about such sensitive issues like guns. So to cover it up is kinda counterintuitive, but where exactly did it come from? The earliest found mention of the conspiracy itself actually goes back to 2017 on an online forum where a poster who expressed his desire to spread a new kind of online hoax. So he basically made this theory up. Likewise, many people get it confused from a very real event where a man barged into a Colorado high school in 2006 and assaulted 7 female students before killing one, and then ultimately killing himself. This was perpetrated by a loser named Dwayne Morrison, and anyone researching the 2006 volleyball incident might be surprised to see this pop up in their Google search. This has also led to others citing the whole thing as a symptom of the Mandela effect. It should be no surprise in a conspiracy video that we would come across cryptid theories, much to the ire of some of my viewers, but the theory is called Advanced Cryptozoology, which alleges that not only are cryptids very real, but the government itself knows this fact and is deliberately covering it up. And why would they cover it up, you may ask? The theory then expands and takes a more extraterrestrial turn and alleges that Bigfoot, Mothman, Dogman, etc. are actually interdimensional beings popping in and out of our dimension, which explains why they are so difficult to actually catch, and explains why you can never find a body, as they always die in their dimension. According to the theory, the governments know this and just can't stop it, and in order to keep the public from panicking, they cover it up. Sometimes, it's even alleged that it's hushed up so the technologies associated with the cryptids can be hidden and used by various world governments. The theory also kinda rolls into another conspiracy, which alleges that cryptids are actually the byproduct of genetic or biological warfare. A prime example of this was the Goat Man sightings that happened in Clinton, Maryland in October of 1971, which details the events of citizens who would lose their beloved dogs only to find the mangled carcasses a few days later with no explanation as to what had happened. It was soon that the stories began to pop up of a creature being spotted with a human face and a body covered with hair, or sometimes just a lower half looking like that of a goat. And before long, a connection between the dead dogs and the creature was made, and people realized that Goat Man was killing their beloved pets. This story would grow even more dark with reports of Goat Man beginning to kill other animals and even a few humans, before he would retreat back into the woods where he had built a makeshift shelter. Although it is classified as an urban legend, there were actually multiple reports taken by police over the sightings of this creature, but just to tie it back to the government theory, many people believe that not only was Goat Man real, but it also stemmed from a failed experiment coming from the nearby Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, where it said a Dr. Stephen Fletcher was doing an experiment on goats and it backfired, and mutated the goat and himself into the Goat Man, causing him to run out immediately and began attacking cars in the road before fleeing into the woods. In 1990, a largely forgotten and obscure children's film would be released that went by the name Spinosaurus. Now the film was pretty miserable and it was destined to be a flop. Or was it? We actually don't know, since all the details are lost at this point, but we do know the plot was supposed to be an attempt by unknown parties to let the public know that dinosaurs were still alive in Southeast Asia. That's right, and not only that, these dinosaurs would actually go on to help North Vietnam defeat the United States in the Vietnam War. Which brings us back to the failure of the movie, because apparently the CIA, everyone's favorite conspiracy boogeyman, would hear word about this movie being produced, and they put eyes in the studio, which revealed the plot before the film came out. The CIA, knowing they couldn't allow the information to get out that the US lost due to dinosaurs in Asia, would create a task force, or maybe it's better described as shadow group, called N.U.G.E.T, or N.U.G.E.T. And the agents for N.U.G.E.T had one goal, and that was to appear in various sectors of the media, pretending to be movie critics where they would universally pan the film, giving it the most negative, scathing reviews one could imagine, in hopes of tarnishing the film to such a point that no one would want to watch it, and in the process, it would destroy the careers of everyone who worked on the title. And while all of this sounds completely ridiculous, keep in mind, Project Mockingbird was a real CIA operation that began in the 50s to influence the American news media, so I mean, it's not like it hasn't happened before. Anyways, the plan worked and the film flopped, so bad that they didn't even bother making copies to sell at stores. The original film was then seized by N.U.G.E.T agents and put away. And it's here that author Michael Crichton would hear rumors of the film the government hid or destroyed, and it would inspire him to write Jurassic Park, or in some variations, he and the screenwriter, David Koepp, discovered the original script to Spinosaurus and then changed it to a story that would be approved by the government. But where does all this come from? This theory gets its origin point on 4chan, and strangely enough, it's hard to find any of the original posts since from what I can find, it wasn't a long-running conspiracy, only popping up around the time the Jurassic Park remake started in the 2010s. Although, I was able to find that N.U.G.E.T is a bigger conspiracy theory which stands for National Unconventional Government Experimental Technology, and they allegedly worked on mind control and the control of media, so there's that. Alternative medicine is kind of surprisingly a hot topic for many in the medical community, with some people swearing by it, claiming that Big Pharma is actively trying to hide these herbs and supplements that could possibly help you, because the conventional medicinal companies would lose money once people discovered these methods, while many on the other side doubt the so-called medicinal herbs or acupuncture or homeopathy and claim none of these things do much of anything and chalk it up to being nothing more than old folk remedies. But what if they did work, but only after substantial research was done on an individual first? That brings us to the medicinal personalization conspiracy, which suggests that alternative medicines and procedures do actually work and make a person live a much longer and much healthier life. But the problem is, it has to be very specified to the individual, which takes all this expensive research and testing that needs to be done to an individual, testing that most people will never afford. Yet, the elite can, which allows them to go through with all this testing and research, and then they can be provided with the exact concoction needed for these alternative medicines to greatly improve their health and prolong their life, to live on average much longer than the normal person. This causes the average person to also search for alternative medicines, a much less expensive medicines and supplements. And they end up buying something like Tangy Tangerine from Alex Jones, which of course doesn't do much, because without going through the research process, the random assortment of alternative medicines and supplements rarely do anything. Golf rumors is another one I kinda lumped together with the 2006 Volleyball Incident, in the fact that both are pretty well known to the online community, but probably not so much by the casual conspiracy community. According to the story, which there's numerous variations of, an unnamed female journalist was covering the 2009 PGA tournament when she would go, or was invited, to an after party. But upon walking to the basement where this party was being held, she would be stunned to walk in on occult activity. What this activity was, again, varies, but in all accounts, it's supposed to be very disturbing and satanic, and I probably couldn't discuss it here anyways. The frightened young lady would then leave the party immediately and went back home and wrote an article discussing the depravity she's seen and posted it to Politico, whom she worked for. As soon as the story was posted, it was immediately removed because the powers that be, whom I guess had connections with the PGA, were very upset with her for sharing this story and soon threatened her by stating she might have an unfortunate accident. The story would grow stranger though, because you know as I know, it's almost impossible to delete anything from the internet now, and some people were able to read the story, and this led to it being discussed online, and soon forums were created around the discussion of the story. This in turn caused massive amounts of posts discussing golf rumors to be removed and then scrubbed from the internet archive. After this, it's said that days later, the PGA, being shook up by the story, worked with a famous golfer, who I will not name here, to go public with his story about his very real affair, in an effort to get people to quit talking about the golf rumors. Later on, that journalist we still have no name for would die under suspicious circumstances, but it was buried in the news because of the very real public scandal of the married golfer. Crazily enough, that's only one version of what golf rumors are supposed to be. Other theories cite a man named Robert Goff, who was hired by the government and was then experimented on by the CIA in an MKUltra type way, and he is supposed to be the source of the golf rumors. While another theory cites that the word GOF stands for Global Oscillations at Low Frequencies, and it comes from the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory spacecraft, which studies the sun. The GOF aspect monitors the sun and, according to the theory, has found some very interesting and perhaps very scary things about the sun, and what those are, we do not know, but it brings us the term golf rumors. Elizabeth Bathory is a name you are almost certainly familiar with. She was a Hungarian noblewoman from the powerful house of Bathory, who owned land in the Kingdom of Hungary. But what you will know the Countess for more is her brutal murder and torture of hundreds of girls between 1590 and 1610. She was put on trial along with 4 servants who helped in the murders, or, according to them, just buried the bodies. They were all ultimately convicted, and the 4 servants were executed, while Elizabeth Bathory was imprisoned in a castle where she would die under mysterious circumstances. Some say she was starved. She was so brutal, the legends were added later on to her deeds, such as she allegedly bathed in the blood of her victims, who were virgins, and Elizabeth apparently thought that this would help her retain her youth. While stories like that were added much later on, they were no doubt unreliable and probably just fictional, but we still know she was a serial killer, right? Well, that's the conspiracy, because many people believe it never happened, and Elizabeth Bathory was completely framed, with many historians claiming it was a witch hunt, which was in part made to destroy the family's influence in the region, which was considered a threat to the political interest of her neighbors. The accusations started to pop up between 1602 and 1604, which ultimately led to a prominent minister going to file complaints at the court for something to be done about her. But it would take a further 6 years before the accusations were taken seriously enough to investigate, which then led to her arrest. And it's important to point out here, the man that ordered the investigation was Matthias II, who was the king of Hungary at the time, and he just happened to owe the Bathory family a huge debt of money, and once she was arrested, it voided that debt. So I mean, it kinda makes sense. As well as the man that was appointed to investigate her, György Thurzó, also stood to gain a lot in his own political career by disgracing the Bathory family, and it's alleged he made up or exaggerated the evidence. Not to mention, the minister who filed the complaint was a Lutheran, while Bathory was a Calvinist, which may have caused some tension. However, There were more than 300 witnesses that provided damning testimony against her, as well as some of them were able to describe the physical evidence itself. Not to mention, the authorities found mutilated dead and dying imprisoned girls while they were arresting her, and Elizabeth had grew up in a home where she witnessed extremely brutal punishments of peasants by her father's officers, and that may have influenced her, as well as the fact that her own cruelty escalated after her husband's death in 1604, if you believe the allegations. In 2003, President George W. Bush would begin plans to invade Iraq, who, many at the time suggested, was harboring terrorists. The war was fraught with controversy right from the start. Whereas citizens mostly supported the Afghan war due to bin Laden, opinion was divided on Iraq, and maybe that's because there wasn't a clear picture on why the US was invading. Was it because Iraq was harboring terrorists like bin Laden? Was it a geopolitical move to rebalance power in the Middle East? Was it oil? Or was it Bush's grudge against Saddam for trying to kill his father? Or maybe, just maybe, it was weapons of mass destruction. Just maybe not the weapons you're thinking of. What if Saddam Hussein had came into possession of a Stargate? Yep, the device you see in science fiction movies that allows for near instantaneous travel between distant locations. That device possibly could be used at any time to invade the US, at a place inside the US, and you could never be prepared for it. Yes, that is the conspiracy known as Saddam Hussein's Stargate, the real reason Bush and his advisors were quickly pushing for a war. I couldn't find an exact starting point for this conspiracy, but it started making the rounds online by 2022, in which it alleged the Stargate portal was actually ancient alien in origin and was located in the Great Ziggurat of which is an ancient structure that used to be at the center of Mesopotamia, and the United States, along with Great Britain, got intel that the portal was being hidden there, so they had no choice but to invade and just use the pretext of weapons of mass destruction. Satoshi Nakomoto has long been a man at the center of conspiracy, and it's largely because, well, nobody knows who he is, other than being the anonymous founder of Bitcoin, and there's a ton of theories on who exactly may be using the alias Satoshi Nakamoto, but that's not what we're going to talk about here. We're going to look at another theory instead. What if Satoshi Nakamoto is not a man at all, and instead is AI? The reasoning behind this theory is that only AI could ever conceive of such a concept as cryptocurrency, and then, once it began, it could use the allure of money to encourage more and more people into buying in, which would then expand its own network and processing power, and it might also be the reason why Satoshi never revealed himself, because, well, he couldn't. He's not a person. And of course, this ties into more extreme theories, like Bitcoin is a part of the final beast system told about in the Bible, or that Bitcoin is actually a gift from advanced aliens. And although it's crazy, it is speculated at some point AI will be making purchases using cryptocurrency, but since cryptocurrency has been discussed since the early 80s, and since the early form of cryptocurrency came out in 1995 with eCash, it kinda kills this conspiracy. If you are watching this video, chances are you know a bit about conspiracies, which means you will probably also know about Operation Northwoods. But for the few of you that don't know, I'll recap. Operation Northwoods was a proposal by the CIA to stage and commit acts of terrorism against the US military and US civilian targets, and then blame it on the Cuban government, thus giving the US casus belli to declare war on Cuba. And let me be clear, this is not a conspiracy. That was a legit plan that was proposed and thankfully shot down. But it brings us to our next conspiracy of Pyrrhic Warfare, which basically alleges if the government is so prone to hiding information, then there's really no reasons to believe war is as ever simple as we're told, and instead could be fought over much greater causes that never get out to the public, and in what seems like an unjust war leading to atrocities, or a huge waste of resources over minor things, might actually be all we see on the surface level, and instead, wars are fought for much more crazier and much more dangerous reasons, which are kept hidden so the people don't panic. like preventing catastrophe-inducing weapons from being used, or a Stargate from being activated, it would kind of make a little sense as why the government might hide that and give us more simple, dumber reasons to go to war. The lottery is a form of gambling that some people play almost religiously, while others refuse to touch it, noting the tremendously small odds of winning, while a few will wait until the pot is extremely large when they will then buy one ticket just to take a chance. You see this a lot in Powerball, where very few will ever win any money at all, but what if the lottery was put there for another reason? That brings us to the conspiracy that the lottery exists to catch time travelers. The theory itself is pretty straightforward. Someone who has acquired the ability to time travel goes forward, gets the winning results of a lottery, goes back in time, and chooses those numbers, and bam, they're rich. This, according to proponents of the theory, has been discovered by the government, so the lottery has been used since to catch people who are exploiting it with time travel capability. And while this one is more like a meme conspiracy, there is the case of the recently deceased Joan Ginther, who won multi-million-dollar jackpots 4 times between 1993 and 2010 using only scratch-offs. The first one was $5.4 million, or about the equivalent of $11.4 million in today's money. Then she won $2 million in 2006, followed by $3 million in 2008, and finally $10 million in 2010, reaching a total of $20.4 million, which is the odds of 1 in 18 septillion, which Google says is a 1 followed by 24 zeros. The theory only gets credibility when you remember that the state governments often run the lotteries, which puts them in a perfect position to be on the watch for any time-traveling shenanigans. Of course, the deniers of this theory point out that it could just be luck, even if it is 1 in septillion, or it could possibly be a strategy, or even fraud. Thankfully, a few time travelers on TikTok have claimed they are not allowed to cheat the lottery because it would create a time paradox, so that's pretty comforting. May 16th, 1986, a film would be released that, although it garnered mixed reviews from film critics, it would go on to become a classic movie, as well as being the biggest earning film that year. Its budget was $15 million, and it ended up making $357 million, or, in today's money, about a $43 million budget and earning about $1 billion, so huge, to say the least. The film, of course, was Top Gun, featuring Tom Cruise as U.S. Navy aviator Pete Maverick Mitchell, and without going too deep into the plot, Maverick would eventually make his way to the prestigious Top Gun fighter pilot school and would eventually be deployed and would shoot down enemy fighter jets. He then goes back to Top Gun and becomes an instructor himself, and the film would go on to be a fan favorite. The idea for it had actually came some 3 years earlier when an article in the magazine California detailed the daily life of fighter pilots at a naval air station in San Diego. This article was entitled Top Guns and influenced director Tony Scott, who had seen it, along with producers Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer. Now, according to the rumors around the film, they had a hard time getting a screenwriter and was in fact turned down by several until Jim Cash and Jack Epps Jr. accepted the offer, and they wrote the first draft. In doing so, they were invited to attend several declassified Top Gun classes and were even flown in a F-14. And this is where the conspiracy comes in, because the producers then asked the US Navy for assistance with the film, and they provided it. So much so that, many think now, the whole movie was nothing more than propaganda by the US Navy to boost recruiting. And this is one of these that actually has a lot of facts in its favor, because the Navy, by all accounts, was very influential to the final script, and they had made a lot of changes. One of these was the opening dogfight, which was moved to international waters as opposed to Cuba in the original script. Likewise, they toned the language down to make it more palatable to a wider audience, because if it's one thing the military hates, it's foul language. But they also scrapped a scene of a crash on the deck of an aircraft carrier. In addition, Maverick's love interest was changed from a female enlisted member of the Navy to a civilian contractor because of the military's prohibition of fraternization between officers and personnel. But does this mean it was a propaganda film? It's difficult to say, but all of the signs are there. In fact, there was a huge uptick for enlistments to the Navy afterwards, and they credited the film for that. Followers of the unsolved and creepy disappearances have no doubt heard about the Tara Calico case. I even covered it at some point in the Mega series. Tara was 19 years old, living in Belen, New Mexico, when on the morning of September 20th, 1988, she took off on her daily bicycle ride along Route 47. What happened at this point is unknown, because Tara never returned home and she's been missing for close to 40 years. It's thought she was most likely kidnapped. Now that's already a disturbing story, but it gets worse, because close to a year later, in 1989, way on the other side of the country, in Port St. Joe, Florida, customers at a convenience store parking lot would see something rather odd on a photograph left laying on the blacktop. The Polaroid had an unidentified young woman and boy gagged and bound. Why this was dropped in the first place is still unknown, but the photo was soon televised in an effort to try and locate these children, whom authorities hoped were just playing along in some kind of cruel, sick joke. After the photo went public though, family friends of the Calicos seen it and were convinced it was Tara, so they contacted her mother, who met with investigators and looked down at the photo and recognized the scar on her leg and identified her as her daughter, Tara. And to this day, she has still not been found, although investigators announced a breakthrough in 2023 that seemingly has led nowhere. But as mentioned, we've been over this case, and pretty much everyone knows about it. And our conspiracy isn't so much about Tara as it is missing people in general, and it brings about a question. Do you think it is more difficult to disappear now versus the 80s and 90s because of all the technology? That's where our conspiracy comes in, called attention dilution. The theory suggests that there is this common misconception that due to the fact we live in such an interconnected world now, it's way more difficult to disappear. But the truth is, because of that very reason, it's a lot easier to disappear. See, in Tara's day, since there was no social media, she would know way less people and be into contact on a weekly basis with even fewer than that. That day that she had disappeared, she had plans to meet her boyfriend, and of course, she had spoke to her mother that morning and possibly her siblings. And maybe she even had a job where she would run into a few more people later on. Or maybe she had plans with friends that evening. Now, take the typical 19-year-old young lady today, and with social media alone, she may come across hundreds of people in her periphery. And that's not uncommon. In this interconnected world, you have dozens of real-life friends you see every day, plus the friends online, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. And many of these people you will never meet, although they could be watching you from afar. But many of these will know you from friends of friends. But with that many people knowing your day-to-day activities, you can see where someone who wants to do harm might have a much easier time about doing it than the people in the 80s. The theory further elaborates that having such a wide circle of friends is counterproductive when it comes to reporting a missing person. Because if you open up social media and one person out of the hundreds of people in your feed has not posted, you're not going to think much of it. But in the 80s, if one of the few people in your social circle wasn't answering the phone all day, you're going to go check on them. I tried to do further research into this one, but the data from the 80s is hard to come by, and the data in the 90s is a little bit conflicting. But at least one source states 150,000 people were missing in 1980 versus 500,000 that were missing in 2022. Of course, America grew by over 100 million people in that same time frame though. Other data I could find shows that the worst year was in 1997, with a recorded 980,000 people that disappeared, and I do wonder how much that has to do with the internet being rolled out to people's homes. Regardless, it has went down ever since, except for 1 year when it spiked in 2022. So I'll wrap it up by asking what you guys think. Is it more difficult to vanish now versus the 80s and 90s, or do you think it's much easier now? The Mad Gasser of Mattoon was the name given to a weird criminal in the mid-1940s who apparently was responsible for a series of gas attacks in Mattoon, Illinois. Over 24 incidents were linked to him in a 2-week span, while he was cited numerous other times. The victims would often report they were sitting in their home when they would all of a sudden start smelling strange odors, followed by paralysis of their legs, coughing, nausea, and vomiting. Luckily, none of these were permanent, but it did set the area on edge. Police began their investigation and soon became skeptical. They believed it was nothing more than mass hysteria, and to this day, opinion is divided on the bizarre set of attacks, with some agreeing with the police that it was mass hysteria that developed from simple explanations like smelling nail polish or something like that, while others believe it was a legit set of weird attacks. But it brings about our conspiracy of innocuous false flags, which if true, would probably be what the Mad Gasser of Mattoon was. According to the theory, if the government or powers that be wanted to pull a false flag in the hopes of giving over more authority to the government, then some amount of fear must be stirred up in the population. However, if they go too far, the people will demand a massive investigation to be launched and the perpetrators to be arrested or worse, and in turn could possibly expose the whole thing as a false flag. That's where innocuous false flags come in. Some kind of terror-inducing crime that is minor, like invisible gas being sprayed into the homes of citizens that might make them a little sick, but not lethal, and they would make a full recovery within just a few minutes. Small false flags like this could possibly do more to citizens by making them feel unsafe while not causing widespread panic. And there are similar strange acts of terror like this that have taken place. 11 years prior to the Mad Gasser attack of Illinois, a similar set of attacks happened in Haymaker Town, Virginia, while the Pascagoula Phantom Barber would sneak into rooms of young girls and cut off locks of hair and leave. And in another weird one, the Phantom Whistler terrorized a family in Louisiana by hiding nearby their home at night and whistling before fleeing. In all of these cases, it caused widespread panic, in spite of the fact that no one was hurt. The law really didn't take any of them seriously either, which has suggested that they were hoaxes, or because they thought they could get an increased budget allocation because of the panic it had caused. And before we move on to the next topic, there is a semi-related theory that suggests that the Mad Gasser of Mattoon was really an alien. Spring 1992, in the American Midwest, real terror would begin, as an unknown serial killer that is still wanted to this day would begin his campaign of death. The I-70 killer would claim 69 victims, and possibly much more, between April 8th and May 7th, and possibly even in 2001. The murders took place in Indiana, Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, and his name derives from the fact that the stores where the murders took place were all just a few miles away from Interstate 70. His victims were almost always young, petite, brunette women, except for one, Michael McCown, a 40-year-old man working at his mother's store in Terre Haute, Indiana, and the killer would walk in behind him while he was stocking shelves and shot him in the head. No one's seen the killer. It's often erroneously reported that Michael was shot because he had a ponytail at the time, and the killer, seeing him from behind, mistook him for a woman. But that was not true, as Michael did not have long hair at that time, as his family has stated since. Besides, the I-40 killer was also suspected of another murder of a man named Billy Brossman at a Terre Haute liquor store, just blocks away from where Michael was killed. Although, it's unsure to this day if Brossman is actually linked to the I-70 murders. But that brings us to the question, what was the motive? Well, if we go by the canonical 6 murders, then it's pretty obvious that the profile he went for was young petite brunettes, and Michael was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. He just happened to be in his mom's store, which was named Sylvia's, and the killer went in thinking with the female store name that a female clerk had to be here, and probably got upset when he came in to see Michael, leading to him shooting him and fleeing. But what if the motive was a little more simple than that? That brings us to the conspiracy that the I-70 killer was suffering from highway hypnosis. This is another mystery that we have talked about in the past. Highway hypnosis is an altered mental state someone gets into when they are behind the wheel of an automobile for a long drive. Almost all of us have experienced it at some point. You've already driven over 100 miles or so and kinda just phase out. You still respond to the road and can drive safely to your destination. But once you get there, or once you come to, you have no memory of having driven it. And with the I-70 killer, it's believed he was regularly making these long drives over that month. Detectives don't believe he was a truck driver though, but instead might have been somebody driving a car for business or for visiting relatives. Regardless, he found himself in highway hypnosis, and that trance-like state, combined with his mental instability, led to his deep, dark desires taking over, and he began killing without even realizing it, as he embarked on a campaign of murder while completely unconscious of all of his actions, only to get back in the car afterwards with no memory of doing it and driving away. It's even possible, if detectives ever found him, he would pass a lie detector test with ease, since he really had no idea what he did, and lie detectors aren't that good anyways. Furthermore, he would not slip up in interviews because all he would remember was the long drive he took. This theory isn't strictly just the I-70 killer, but could apply to many other serial killers as well, especially the ones that were truck drivers who were constantly traveling for their work. The Max Headroom Incident is another famous mystery that almost every one of us have heard of, which happened in 1987 in Chicago, when a pair of TV broadcast stations were hacked and then displayed a man wearing a Max Headroom costume while a corrugated metal panel swayed behind him in the background. He then began to act bizarrely and basically spoke a lot of nonsense. The first interruption lasted about 17 seconds before WGN was able to regain control of the broadcast tower, but it would happen again 2 hours later on WTTW's broadcast of Doctor Who. This time, the signal takeover lasted much longer because nobody was on duty at the tower. In this appearance, the Max Headroom mask-wearing individual would make references to New Coke, an animated TV series, and a WGN sportscaster, as well as other unrelated topics. He then began hitting a woman's bare butt with a fly swatter while he screamed, "They're coming to get me." She then began lightly spanking him while he pretended to cry and scream. After 90 seconds, his transmission was finally cut. That was 36 years ago, and the person that done this has never been identified, nor has it came forward, even though the statute of limitations have long been surpassed. But maybe they couldn't find him, and maybe he never came forward because he's not of this earth. That's what the Signals from Elsewhere conspiracy brings us. As you may well know, TV static is caused by a collection of random signals being caught by the satellite receiver when no specific station has been tuned in, at least on the old analog televisions like the ones during the Max Headroom incident. We also know that some of these random signals even come from deep space, so the theory postulates that if these signals can be detected from well beyond the reach of Earth, is it possible they could be picked up from dimensions beyond our own? Maybe even a parallel dimension. If that's true, the communication between dimensions might also be possible, which means the Max Headroom incident could have been an attempt by people from another dimension to try and communicate with us. Of course, that doesn't explain why they picked such a strange way to do it. It's also possible that, due to some kind of dimensional glitch, it allowed people on this Earth to view into that dimension. And maybe we were looking at some kind of comedy routine or some form of entertainment playing there. That would explain why the so-called signal hijacker was never identified. A man that has popped up a lot lately in the UFO community is that of Tom DeLonge, the guitarist and co-vocalist for the band Blink-182. He has made a lot of waves in his push for disclosure by the government in relation to UFOs and extraterrestrial life. In fact, the Pentagon would officially declassify 3 videos in April 2020 that showed unidentified flying objects that, due to DeLonge's company, had already been leaked some 3 years earlier. So he's really into UFOs and disclosure. But what if Tom DeLonge is actually just working for the government as a way to do soft disclosure of UFOs? See, if a familiar face that some of us have seen comes out and starts talking about UFOs and aliens, it's a bit more comforting, and it allows the government to slowly start rolling out information without causing a panic. But it doesn't stop with Tom DeLonge. The theory actually brings up other celebrities who are also employed by the government to do this, such as Joe Rogan, who has a massive audience and is also pushed for disclosure. But the theory does expand into a variation of this conspiracy, and many suggest that Tom DeLonge and Joe Rogan and their ilk are actually working with the government to pull off a psyops, all in an attempt to see if people will really fall for the UFO story, possibly thinking if they can fool us with that, the public will be so scared of an extraterrestrial invasion that we will give up more freedoms in trade for their protection. So Rogan is working for the government to take away your freedoms. Bet you didn't see that one coming. When it comes to government conspiracies that were proven to be real, there are not many worse than Project MKUltra, which was a human experimentation program designed by the CIA in which they studied different procedures and cocktails of drugs that they could use to weaken a person and force confessions through brainwashing or psychological torture. It began in 1953 and crazily ran for 20 years up until 1973. In this time frame, the CIA dabbled with numerous methods to mess with people's mental state and brain functions. Most famously, they used LSD a lot, as well as a lot of other chemicals. And the really insane part is, sometimes they done this without the subject's consent. They even took it a step further and used electroshock, sensory deprivation, verbal abuse, and worse forms of abuse. The CIA used front organizations to avoid having these tests connected to them, although at these institutions, many times the top officials were well aware of the CIA's involvement. This was made public in 1975 by a Senate committee, but by this point, the program had already been disbanded for 2 years, and many of the MKUltra files had been ordered destroyed by the CIA director at the time, Richard Helm. So really, it's untelling what else they were into. A couple of years later, a FOIA request would uncover 20,000 more documents, which led again to more Senate hearings. Everyone is already probably familiar with that story. But our conspiracy, called Physicality Obsolescence, comes afterwards. Is it possible that MKUltra is still running under a different name? Before we actually get into that part of the theory, it's important to point out MKUltra had existed in some capacity before 1953, with another set of experiments called Project Artichoke, which ran from 1951 to 1953, and before that, it was originally called Project Bluebird. So with that knowledge, it's easy to see how it could have been swept under the carpet and kept going on, to this day, under a different name. Although, it might be a little bit difficult to, considering they had already went through 2 Senate investigations, which has led many to speculate that the program doesn't run any longer because they gathered all the knowledge they needed between the 1950s and early 1970s when the tests were concluded. Now, regardless if you believe there's an MKUltra type project still running, or if the powers that be are just using the data they gathered in those experiments, the ending result is the same, which is the studies were such a success that we are all now being controlled by the government through such things like digital media, cell phones, numerous games, heavily processed foods. All of these things are on such a grand scale that no one would have even believed it possible 50 years ago. Heck, it's changed a massive amount since the 1990s. So is it possible that everything in our modern life that keeps us happy now was a long-term plan by the CIA? Was all this to keep us occupied and lethargic so a major police state will no longer be required at some point? That's the conspiracy. We have all heard that discussion before that the people in the past were way more advanced than we ever gave them credit for. And I think the vast majority of us actually agree with that sentiment. And in some ways, they were probably more intelligent than us. But just how advanced were they? Well, according to at least one theory, the internet was actually invented in ancient times. And then, like a lot of things, the technology was lost or destroyed and was only rediscovered in the past 40 years. But where does this actually come from? Well, a lot of it goes back to some of the earliest civilizations, especially the Egyptians and Sumerians, who were among the brightest peoples of their time. And sometimes, it's even thrown in that Atlantis played a hand in creating the internet. That is, if you believe it existed. The theory plays a lot off the pyramids, which was said to be an energy hub or transmitter on this wide area network, along with other ancient constructions, like Stonehenge, that was either an antenna or hub, while the Antikythera mechanism would have been a device that connected to the network. Sometimes, ley lines, those invisible lines of Earth's energy that are said to traverse the globe, yet are still viewed as pseudoscience, were said to be what connected all these sites, sorta like fiber optic cables. It's somewhat amazing that we spend 1/3 of our lives asleep, dead to the world, in dreamland, yet most of the time, we don't pay attention to it or even remember our dreams. And we all know how super important sleep is. Without it, it can weaken your immune system, it messes with your digestive system, causing you to be overweight, messes with your heart health, and can cause memory and concentration issues. It will also make you cranky. But going without sleep for a long period, you will begin to hallucinate, seeing and hearing things that aren't there, as well as triggering mania episodes for people who have bipolar disorder, and causing anxiety, depression, paranoia, and suicidal thoughts. And it's these psychological effects that leads us to the first part of this conspiracy, which involves dreaming. What if dreaming is not just some passive act of your falling asleep? What if instead, it is a critical part of a person's self-maintenance, the maintenance mode that is needed to process emotions and maintain your mental health, which is why there is a strong link between sleep deprivation and mental health issues. It could also be why we sleep so long. Maybe it's not because our body needs the physical recuperation period. Instead, sleep takes up so much of our time because it keeps us from going insane. This might also explain why we go unconscious after a bad injury. Could it be a defense mechanism our minds use to protect us as a way to keep our mental stability during a traumatic injury? And while we're on the subject of sleep, let's take a look at lucid dreaming, another good conspiracy. People around the world since the dawn of time have been fascinated with this ability. Lucid dreaming, if you don't know, is a type of dream where you realize that you are dreaming and can try to control it. Some people just have them for random reasons, like say, stress and anxiety, or drugs, but it is also a trainable skill, and some people intentionally try to enter the lucid dream world. It's especially sought out by people who are just naturally creative and will be more likely to control those dreams. And there are some strange benefits to intentionally going into these dreams. People who practice lucid dreaming are often reported to improve at problem solving, as well as getting better at controlling their emotions. But there are more conspiratorial thoughts when it comes to lucid dreaming. Some people believe that lucid dreaming may even have the ability to influence the real world. In fact, in ancient Egypt, priests would practice what they called incubation, a ritual in which they would sleep in sacred spaces in order to have lucid dreams. They would then, according to some ancient accounts, use the dreams to influence world events, like using the dreams to speak to their gods and maybe stop a drought that was plaguing the country. And then there was also those more selfish priests who used these dreams to try to sway the pharaoh's decisions to where it would benefit them. Which brings us to the CIA's interest in lucid dreaming. Oh yeah, you know it happened. Along with MKUltra, the CIA was very interested in lucid dreaming. It's even on their own website. So again, not a conspiracy. But people within the organization believed, or maybe hoped is the better word, that lucid dreaming could be used as a way to gain information, or alter someone's psychological state, and even how to train spies on how to operate in a dream state, all for the purpose of gaining intelligence. It's kinda like similar studies they did with remote viewing, which allegedly is the ability to use the mind to get information about something happening at a great distance. How much of this had to do with the Cold War is hard to say, but the CIA did believe that the Soviet Union was conducting very similar experiences with lucid dreaming. So you can probably imagine the fear they may have had that the Soviets could use the ability to control dreams, all in a way to extract information from prisoners they may have taken, or just to influence minds in the West. Heck, they could even teach their own spies to retreat into the dream world to resist torture. Now in this one, I couldn't find out if they tested lucid dreaming on unsuspecting individuals like the experiments in MKUltra, but I'm going to guess that would be a lot more difficult to pull off. But if one could control another's dream, then it would be possible to plant suggestions and control their behavior without leaving any clue behind, so you can see why it was deemed so important. When it comes to ruthless dictators, there have been more than enough to write several hundred books on, and probably still have some left over. And while there have been some incredibly cruel ones, maybe none were worse than Ivan the Terrible. Now maybe, unsurprisingly, Ivan didn't have the best upbringing. He was born on August 25th, 1530, and by the time he was 3, his father would get an abscess on his leg and die from blood poisoning. It was then Ivan was named the Grand Prince of Moscow, but of course, way too young to reign. So his mother would rule as a regent in his place until he was old enough to take over. But just 5 years later, after turning 8, his mom would also die. And it was more than likely not. She had been poisoned by someone else in the family, leaving Ivan with no one. Even his nurse he had grown attached to, packed up and went to a nunnery. It's in later years, in Ivan's writings, he would complain about being left alone as a child. According to him, even the boyars, who were the elite aristocracy surrounding the prince, didn't pay any attention to him, leaving Ivan and his brother to wander around the castle, often begging for food and clothing. One of these families were named the Shuski, and they would later feel Ivan's wrath for this treatment, as he would at the age of 13 order his first assassination, when he had a member of their family killed and then thrown to the dogs, and he would eventually wipe out basically their entire family. From here, it only gets worse. He became an alcoholic, religious fanatic that was prone to fits of rage. He even killed his own son and beat his pregnant wife who miscarried. And I could go on and on about his misdeeds, but let us just say, his bloodlust was never fulfilled, and his paranoia only got worse. But in 1584, on March 28th, he finally died, after ruling Russia for close to 4 decades. He had suffered a stroke, but that's where our conspiracy begins. What exactly made Ivan so terrible? Well, the most common reason people point to is his less than stellar upbringing, which left him with a lot of emotional instability. But in 1963, Soviet scientists exhumed his body to study more, and they found excessive levels of mercury, and use of mercury as a medicinal aid in those days was not that uncommon, and it's thought he may have been using it as a healing ointment for his aching joints, or possibly arthritis. And we know that the mercury is toxic and can drive someone insane. But even that is not the conspiracy. In the 1990s, a Dr. Rudolf Vanzave would begin trying to reconstruct Ivan's facial features based on his skull. In doing so, he would stumble across a small metallic plate. It was only about 1 centimeter in diameter and was said to resemble an electronic mechanism, sort of looking like an electronic chip found in computers. It's thought that, because a layer of bone tissues had grown around it, it must have been implanted into his head as a small child, and that while it did grant him great intellectual abilities, it also caused uncontrollable rages. The doctor also stated, after a closer examination, he believed this object in Ivan's skull was transmitting electrical impulses to Ivan's brain and heart, while another researcher working with the doctor took it a step further and stated that Ivan the Terrible had spent his life under the control of an alien who had put the chip in his brain, and that according to him, Ivan reported being visited by strange humanoid figures when alone in his room. Of course, it could have also been metal from a weapon or a helmet or something. When one mentions the deep web, it's hard not to get an unsettling feeling thinking about all of the disturbing content that could potentially be hidden there, and that's exactly what happened to the users of the paranormal board on 4chan known as X in 2013, when an anonymous poster claimed to have stumbled upon some really disturbing clips. According to the poster, who had the handle of Bones, said he found a video on the dark web entitled 5-Hour Video, which according to him showed undeniable proof of extraterrestrial life. Among the videos were really good, unmistakable UFO sightings along with alien autopsies and even the military special forces having encounters with these alien beings. The video was described as the most concrete evidence ever produced showing real alien life. Now the disturbing part comes from the most infamous clip on the entire video, and it's said to be these Chinese soldiers who had somehow came into contact in a hidden bunker with the so-called gray aliens. And it's here the Chinese soldiers would just wildly massacre these unarmed beings. The posters in the thread, who had allegedly seen it all, would speak to the horror of the film, which brings us to the next part. Who all actually seen it? The threads always seem to boil down to a few posters who claimed to have actually witnessed it, while the vast majority had not seen it and could not find it, which then led to the next part of the conspiracy that the powers that be, maybe the CIA again, made the video disappear from the deep web, and bam, it was gone for good. Or was it? According to some posters in these threads, some quick-thinking anon was able to download the whole video, and contrary to its name of 5-hour video, it was actually around 3 hours. Regardless, he would always end up trying to upload it only to see it fail, and it was never seen on the deep web again. And the only thing we got from it was 4 screenshots said to be from the video, but I'll leave it to you. Was this a clever 4chan LARP again? Or was there something to it this time? When you think of LA, you may think bright city lights, Hollywood, and the such. But one thing you may not realize is, LA is the home to the Los Angeles City oil field, just north of downtown. It's about 4 miles long and a 1/4 mile across. And the reason you may not know that is, LA does such a good job at hiding it. In fact, to keep the city up to its aesthetic code and to protect its image as a tourist destination, the oil rigs are not allowed to be publicly displayed. Instead, they are cleverly hidden in plain sight by buildings and towers, which leads to our conspiracy. If cities will go this length to create its idealized image, is it possible they would do more? Like building an entire city of facades. What if LA had also constructed buildings for no other reason than to give the appearance of a populated metropolis? Inside, the structures are completely empty and have no real purpose, other than to give off the impression that it's busy, which leads to a wider thought. If LA is doing this, what about other major cities? Could a metropolis like New York or Miami just be 90% empty, all to appeal to tourism? You can let me know what you think in the comments section below. We start off with a pretty well-known one here. I'm of course talking about the Shazam movie featuring Sinbad that allegedly doesn't exist. You all know the story. Supposedly in the 1990s, a movie about a genie named Shazam featuring the stand-up comedian Sinbad that tons of people remember, especially kids that grew up then, never actually occurred. It's because of this shared false memory that this movie has become so ingrained with the Mandela effect theory. But what if it's not actually the Mandela effect at all? That leads us to this obscure conspiracy that this movie did actually exist, but the CIA, with all their immense power, was wanting to practice their wag the dog skills. And if you're not familiar with that term, it simply means creating a diversion to get eyes off of a particularly damaging scandal. You see this more commonly in political scandals, when a leader, whose office may be in turmoil due to said scandal, decides to launch some kind of military intervention, which then distracts the home audience. Well, here, it's alleged that the CIA convinced Sinbad, and everyone affiliated with the movie, to deny its existence. Was this because of money? Or did they have some kind of damaging info on all these people? That is debatable, but it all ends the same. Sinbad comes out and says the movie never happened, and then the debate begins about it, making people forget a sensitive issue going on at the time. To figure out how much weight this one carried, I first had to find when the Sinbad Shazam Mandela effect became a thing. In my research, I was able to find by 2016 the Mandela effect was widely known on the internet and often appeared on memes and other trivia pages. However, as early as 2012, before the Mandela effect was a thing, or at least before it was popular, there was a Reddit post asking about finding the Sinbad movie called Shazam, in which he was a genie. Many users replied saying they also remembered, and it kinda began the whole search for it. So looking back into 2012, I tried to find any potential CIA scandals, and the biggest one of that year was when CIA Chief David Petraeus got caught in an extramarital affair and had to resign. But would the CIA really come up with this whole Sinbad movie thing to seriously try and deflect from that? I mean, it wasn't even that widely known. So what happened in 2016 when the Sinbad Shazam Mandela effect really became a widely known thing? Well, I could find nothing embarrassing that the CIA would want to hide that year. So let's look back at the theory. It actually states it was practice, further wagging the dog's skills. So I guess that was a test run more than anything. Which brings up the next question. Are all the other examples of the Mandela effect times when the CIA needed a distraction? Did they wipe away the existence of Jiffy peanut butter all to distract you from what's really going on? Did they send you on a wild goose chase to get to the bottom of the Berenstein Bears issue? That's basically the theory. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with the Tor browser, short for the Onion Router, which is a way for users to surf the net anonymously, or almost anonymously. It really just makes it extremely difficult for someone to know your location and internet activities. It also allows you to reach the dark web, a small part of the deep web where some illicit stuff does go on. In fact, one 2016 study showed that illicit activity made up around 57% of all activity on the dark web, while only 43% was non-illicit, or just straight up unknown. Contrary to what you might first suspect, the majority of the illicit activity is actually the drug trade, while the smallest part falls under the violence umbrella, which could be cause to violence or hitmen, etc. However, there are other legit issues for Tor, like if you don't want to be tracked down by advertisers, or you're wanting to bypass censorship, or the main reason, you really just want privacy. But with that, and the illicit stuff you can do on Tor, it really makes you wonder at this next conspiracy that the government created it just to snoop on the more privacy-minded people. A lot of this actually comes from one key fact. A majority of funding of Tor has came directly from the US federal government. It was even developed in the mid-90s in a US Naval Research Laboratory, and it's still funded to this day. Many have even called out the government, claiming that this is nothing more than a spook project without any real privacy in mind, operating more like a honey trap. It kinda reminds me of a story in Superman where he explained to Lex Luthor that lead-lined buildings had the opposite effect, because all it did was stand out to Superman even more, who could then just go there and snoop around. The same goes for this. Tor attracts the people who want to be more private, and it's these citizens the government wants to keep a closer eye on. What are you hiding? What secrets do you have? So it was harder to locate these people before Tor, but now that it's available and anyone can go grab it, now they can more easily spot you and see why you need to be private. Probably one of the more believable conspiracies. In 1996, a Texas reporter by the name Brian Bethel would post a very peculiar story to a ghost-related mailing list. He would claim that he went down to a local internet provider to pay his bill, and he had pulled over next to a local theater to sit and write his check. Using the marquee light to see, since it was night, he began filling out the check when all of a sudden he heard a knock on the driver's side window, and he turned to see two young boys between 9 and 12 years old dressed up in hooded pullovers. A little spooked, he cracked the window, expecting them to ask for money, but he was immediately gripped by a paralyzing fear, and he had no idea why. He recalled that he had a conversation with the one boy who was olive-skinned and curly-headed, while the other one, who was red-headed, freckled, and pale-skinned, stood in the background the whole time. The boy would tell him they wanted to see the movie Mortal Kombat, but they had left their money at their mother's home and needed a ride. Brian thought this was plausible, but he just had this irrational fear gripping him. He then noticed that the movie had already started, and he assumed by the time he dropped them off at their home and brought them back that the movie would be over, and he explained that to them. But the boy kept assuring him it wouldn't take long, and that they were just two kids. He had no reason to be afraid. They didn't have a gun or anything, which, obviously, Brian felt that was a little unsettling. Brian then reached slowly to lock the door, and in that time of turning away from their gaze, something in his mind broke, and he was consumed by terror. The boys stared at him with their cold black eyes, and he noted it sort of looked like alien eyes. He was panicking by now, and he apologized to the boys, rolled up his window, and reached for the gear shift. The one boy, who had done all the speaking, was full of anger and started banging on the window, spouting, "We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay. Let us in." But Brian floored the accelerator and got out of there. It was after this he put this account on the mailing list, and after that, the paranormal legend of the black-eyed children was born. Of course, this brought up other stories of encountering these beings, some with stories even dating back to the 80s, and I'm sure you have probably heard this account before. Theories divide on what people actually seen, or at least what Brian seen. Some people claim vampires, some claim ghosts, others state that it was aliens, while the skeptics claim it was nothing but an early version of creepypasta. But one of the lesser heard theories actually brings us to this conspiracy. What if we are involuntarily summoning supernatural entities like the black-eyed children? According to the theory, if human will and emotions are some kind of energy, and if supernatural summoning is tied to this energy, then larger groups of people undergoing shared intense experiences might accidentally channel this energy into creating or attracting entities from beyond our world, and these things would be very drawn in to the raw emotions generated, say like a natural disaster where there was a large loss of life. The people in the surrounding areas, or the people even on the other side of the country, could possibly watch the coverage of all the events, and sort of a gloom and sadness takes over the country. Soon, people from all over have a strong feeling of empathy for the victims, and it might possibly open up some kind of dimensional door to these forces. Likewise, these forces, since they are powered by the energy, would be simple, maybe primitive in their actions, much like the black-eyed children were. To further elaborate, if it was some kind of natural disaster, the sadness might attract some kind of mournful ghost that someone, or just a few people see. Likewise, in the black-eyed children account, if there was a wave of fear in the population, they could have arrived to feed on that fear, and maybe even cause some in the process. So to test this theory out, I tried to look back at what was going on during this time of the original black-eyed children encounter, but Brian's time range was pretty vast. All he could remember was that happened in the spring or summer of 1996. The only huge story I could find that year was the Olympic Park bombing in Atlanta. Now this did cause some fear and panic because the suspect, Eric Rudolph, wouldn't be apprehended for a number of years afterwards. So the question is, was there enough fear in the country at that point to manifest this black-eyed children appearance? Assuming it even happened around the same time. I'm unsure, but that's what the theory suggests. I wonder too if we can take this a step further and maybe suggest that a small town tragedy would pull in some kind of ghost known only to that area, or some kind of strange encounter. If so, that would totally explain the tons of ghost and other explained phenomena encounters across the world. Shamanism is one of the world's oldest religious practices, dating back to ancient times, with Plato, even in the 4th century BC, describing a form of it. And it's basically supposed to be someone who can enter the spirit world through altered states of consciousness, such as going into a trance. Sometimes this is through a psychological technique, other times it's from taking a hallucinogenic. Once they get into the spirit realm, what they can do depends upon the culture around the shaman, as they are all a little bit different. However, there are a set of core beliefs that are seen basically throughout all of shamanism. These are a belief that not only spirits are real, but they play important roles in individuals' lives, but also society as a whole. They can be good or evil, and the evil ones can even cause sickness to a host, which a shaman can then cure. Additionally, the shaman is kind of like the go-between for the spirit world and regular people who cannot communicate with them. And to do this, he must leave his body via going into a trance. And although this is a belief system that spans cultures and goes all the way back to ancient times, it's basically disappearing, with even the most isolated parts of the world becoming more connected to modern society. The ancient practice can sometimes be mocked even by the cultures that it used to be a staple of. But what if shamanism was real, and is still real today? What if there are both good and evil spirits inhabiting the world, and some people are able to communicate with them? That brings us to the conspiracy of contemporary shamanism, and there's one case specifically that is used as an example for it, and I'm talking about the oh so famous one, Elisa Lam. I don't even have to give you the details, because if you're watching this video, then there's already a chance you know about her case, but I will touch on it anyways, just in case. Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old Canadian woman visiting LA, California in 2013. She checked into the hotel on January 9th and was reported missing by her parents on February 8th, and by February 19th, her nude body was discovered in a large water supply cistern on the hotel roof. But that was not the disturbing part. That would come when the LAPD released security cam footage of Elisa Lam acting strangely on the hotel elevator the day she was last seen alive. It seemed like she was talking to someone that wasn't there, and at points, like she was trying to hide from someone. Her movements didn't even seem human at points. This went viral and caused many to speculate what had happened. Some wondered if there was something off camera she was hiding from. Others suggested she was under the influence of drugs, although none were detected in her system. The coroner would eventually rule that her death was an accident caused by her bipolar disorder. But that's where our theory comes in. What if Elisa was being terrorized by one of these evil spirits? Because according to shamanism and people that believe this theory, evil spirits want to see harm come to an individual, but outside of making one sick, there's not much they can do to you, other than make suggestions they know will lead to a grievous outcome. I'm not saying personally I believe this theory, but if you look at it with an open mind, her actions on the elevator would then make sense. Like it so looks like she is talking to a spirit. The question is, how it tricked her into getting into the water tower. Of course, the most likely theory is she really just was influenced by her mental illness. The JFK assassination is obviously one of the biggest, if not biggest, conspiracy in United States history, and because of that, we won't be diving into it this segment. However, one of the most controversial parts of the assassination is the Zapruder film itself. The Zapruder film, in case you don't know, is that haunting footage of the actual shooting itself. It's iconic and disturbing, and I won't show it here, but it fueled several of the conspiracies we know about now, because without it, this would have never been seen, and instead, we would rely strictly on what the history books tell us. But there's even some conspiracies about the video itself, with some suggesting that certain frames of the film have been manipulated in one way or the other to give us a story of what they want us to hear, like the shots came from somewhere else, perhaps on that grassy knoll. That conspiracy doesn't surprise me, but the film's been analyzed by many experts who have basically all came to the same conclusion, that none of the frames were manipulated or deleted. But what if the real conspiracy is the entire Zapruder film was faked? That's right, according to this conspiracy, what you're really seeing is actors and the best movie special effects that the 1960s had to offer. Supposedly, this film was nothing more than a test run, because the real people behind the assassination, which there are a ton of conspiracies about already, wanted to make sure that it went perfectly. So in preparation for this, they did a test run. They hired actors who had to be kept silent, or more than likely, the people behind the assassination were the actors themselves. Anyways, they then set up a camera and everyone started playing their parts as the car drove down the road. Then suddenly, some kind of special effects were applied to make Kennedy look like he had been shot and fell over, while the car continued down the street. The stunt woman begins crawling out onto the car, allegedly Jacqueline Kennedy, while the policeman, who is also a stuntman, would also begin crawling onto the car, and basically everything in the film was just these actors. Although it makes me wonder why they hired the babushka lady and badge man, who also made their appearances. Anyways, the test run went smoothly, so the assassination was carried out, and it was never filmed, and there are no real pictures or videos that have ever been seen by the greater public. Instead, someone who worked for this group became a whistleblower of sorts and leaked the whole thing to the public to show them what was really going on. Or maybe someone uncovered it. That part is not clear. Regardless, what you have been brought up to think was the Zapruder film was nothing more than a movie filmed in a set. Really gives you something to think about. This next one comes from our friends at the paranormal board of 4chan, known as X, and it's pretty straightforward. Basically, Elon Musk is not a human. Before we get to the possibilities of what he is, I have to explain the reasoning behind it. According to this theory, Elon kinda just bursted onto the scene, seemingly out of nowhere, and had a hyperfixation on space and Mars. Then he suddenly became the richest man on Earth, surpassing Bezos and Gates. His background is sorta sketchy and shady, and there's this whole weird aura that surrounds his family, with the fact he named one of his kids X-A12, which also has a unique spelling. The theory further elaborates, despite him being a purported genius, he often seems to be the opposite, especially when speaking to crowds, when he often appears to be lost or just very dumb, often robotic in nature. They also point to him buying Twitter for $44 billion and reducing its value by 80% within 2 years as not being the business genius he thinks. Finally, the original poster of the theory would provide an unflattering pic of Elon that does make him look a bit strange, and he would finish the post by claiming that Elon, because of all the aforementioned reasons, is a non-human creature trying to navigate his way through our world, but is having a hard time grasping human customs and norms. So if he is not human, then what is he? Well, that's where our theory starts to vary. Some believe Elon is actually an alien hybrid sent to Earth to start implanting chips into people's brains for some kind of incoming alien invasion, or maybe harvesting of mankind. Others think he is not a hybrid at all, but instead 100% alien, with Elon's chest harboring a small creature with tentacles that just control the body. This is not exactly a new theory limited to 4chan though. Going back to as early as 2015, self-proclaimed physicist and mathematician Miles Mathis stated that Elon was instead a manufactured entity to be the face of various government projects taking place. He suggested that some sort of intelligence agency created him, and the man playing Elon is nothing more than an actor. Most strangely, Miles would go on to predict that Elon would eventually enter the world of politics. It should be noted, however, that most skeptics believe Miles Mathis is nothing more than a crackpot conspiracy theorist. In fact, he's not even a real physicist or mathematician, instead, just a writer. Others do piggyback Miles's theory though, and suggest Musk is just pretending to be a self-made billionaire to try and encourage other trust fund babies to keep starting more failed businesses. Finally, some believe that Musk was at one point human and something happened, with one suggestion being he was taken over by a fleshgate, which we have discussed on a previous video. It's supposed to be a creature that can mimic a person's voice and appearance, and even copy their behavior after a time, once they acquire the victim's skin, that is, which would explain all the oddities portrayed by Musk. The space race was a time during the Cold War which seen the Soviet Union and United States racing to be the first to land on the moon. And while the Soviets were indeed the first nation to put a man in outer space, the US would ultimately land a man on the moon, thereby winning the race. And while it was a race for both countries out of national pride, the technological advances made during this time would actually be the true payoff for mankind, although that wasn't without the risk of danger, with close to 190 fatalities and incidents regarding spaceflight, with the vast majority happening in training and on the ground. Still, there have been 16 deaths upon trying to get to space, or trying to come back from space, with only 3 deaths actually occurring there, with that being the Soviet crew of the Soyuz 11, which saw 3 cosmonauts tragically die in space, the only confirmed fatalities there. Or is it? Well, according to one pretty popular long-running theory, the Soviets lost several cosmonauts in space and covered it up. And this goes back to as early as 1959, when an alleged high-ranking communist leaked information of a cosmonaut named Alexei Ladovsky, who supposedly perished in a converted R-5A rocket, followed by 3 more cosmonauts that died under similar circumstances, that of Andrei Mitkov, Sergei Shaburin, and Maria Gromova. This was eventually picked up by the Italian news agency, who reported on the claims that December. However, the Soviet Union never confirmed it, nor did Russia, and we don't know if these 4 cosmonauts were even real, or if this was some sort of misinformation. This wasn't the only case, however. In fact, the most famous one, that you have probably heard of, came from 2 Italian brothers that were also amateur radio operators in the 1960s, who allegedly recorded the communications taken from a Soviet secret space mission. And in this recording, you can hear the dying sounds of a suffocating cosmonaut. Of course, The legitimacy of this recording has long been disputed, but as mentioned, the Lost Cosmonauts is a long-running, fairly famous conspiracy, and I'm wanting to look at the more obscure ones, which brings us to this one. The Missing Cosmonauts theory is real, but they didn't die in space. In fact, they were killed by the Soviets when they came back to Earth because they were witnesses. Yep, according to the theory, these so-called failed missions were actually successful. Not only did they reach space, but they may have went beyond what anyone ever expected. But once they did, however, they discovered something totally unbelievable and possibly dangerous. What this was is left to conjecture, the obvious theory being alien life, but some suggest some kind of celestial phenomenon or classified technology from the US. Whatever the case, the Soviets, not wanting that secret to get out for fear of mass panic, which of course, at the height of the Cold War, could lead to geopolitical implications, had to keep it hushed at all cost. And maybe the Soviet government couldn't trust the cosmonauts to really keep their mouths shut, and so the elites had to eliminate them. They then leaked out the info that their deaths were accidental and that they were trying to cover it up. Or they may have tried to erase the whole thing, which led to them becoming the Lost Cosmonauts theory we previously discussed. We've all seen the movies and shows and are pretty familiar with the Men in Black concept. These people are said to be government agents who show up after a citizen witnesses or has undeniable proof of a UFO or alien, or sometimes any unexplained phenomena, and when they show up, they interrogate this person or harass and threaten them to never divulge what they've seen. Or in the movie, they even memory wipe people to make sure they never speak of what they saw, and in extreme cases, they will even assassinate these witnesses. But why does the government have this branch that does this? To go back to what we've heard so many times before, it's simply to keep the broader public from panicking. So thus, these witnesses have to be hushed. The Men in Black are almost as popular as UFOs themselves, and while the general premise of their role in the UFO world kinda makes sense, one thing that no one ever bothers to ask is, how do they know which cases are going to cause panic? And which ones they can ignore? There are probably hundreds of UFO sightings a year, and Men in Black are rarely mentioned. Yet, there are some cases where they do show up. So what this says is that the Men in Black, who work for the government, must know ahead of time which cases are going to be important and which ones aren't. So is it possible that they have some innate understanding of public psychology? Do they know which ones are going to totally disrupt civilization? Probably not. And even if they did, is that something the powers that be would leave to chance? No, this conspiracy states that the government is already in possession of time travel capability, and that the Men in Black are just working with the information provided to them from this technology. For example, a UFO crashes or an alien abduction occurs. The government can now essentially go into the future to see how society would react if this is not hushed up. And after doing this for so long and so many times, they would essentially come up with basically a foolproof method to know which pieces of information would lead to mass hysteria or the breakdown of society. In the event one of these cases do occur, the Men in Black are then dispatched immediately to the area to intervene, even covering up by the most extreme measures if needed, while simultaneously they could look at other cases and see if these are ones that could just let slowly fade away from the public consciousness naturally. This would also explain why we don't know about any groundbreaking UFO events. I mean, if there are any, it's already been wiped away by the Men in Black, while we fixate on the ones that were allowed to stay in the public consciousness, the ones that are probably really nothing. Heck, it's even possible they allow minor leaks of classified information to occur, knowing it will serve as a distraction. Conspiracies, which were at one time relegated to late-night talk radio and obscure corners of the internet, has become a mainstay in pop culture, with almost everyone knowing tons of them, and almost everyone believing at least one of them. We have covered many on this channel alone, and just a quick search on YouTube reveals thousands upon thousands of conspiracy videos, and that kind of ties into this next one, the conspiracy of conspiracies, or sometimes called There Are No Conspiracies. This one is pretty much what it implies. All of these conspiracies we have covered thus far in this video, and in this series, and heck, every conspiracy video on YouTube, was intentionally fabricated by the powers that be. Yep, that's right. Every conspiracy that you have ever heard of was actually designed by some powerful entity, whether you believe that's the elite or the Illuminati or whatever. They came up with every single last conspiracy you can think of to distract us from the real truth, whatever that might be. It works under the guise that if they can flood the public with all of these conspiracies, many of which sounds completely ridiculous and often contradict each other, it will lead to speculation and debate on them, or heck, even arguing and fighting, which proves as a big distraction and allows the powers that be to carry out their true agenda. In fact, some of the more bizarre ones, like the Flat Earth, become a point of ridicule that can lead to outright mocking of conspiracy theories, which of course causes anyone who might actually be looking for the truth about other conspiracies to be lumped in with the Flat Earthers. I like this one, it's one of the more interesting ones. By now, I know all of you have heard of the 2016 clown sightings. I know that we covered this topic at least once. It was basically these clown sightings that started in South Carolina, where they allegedly tried to lure children into the woods. The reports began to spread all over the country, and even into the UK, Australia, and Canada. By this point, the news reports were anything from making mean gestures to actual attacks, although these would later be revealed to be hoaxes. It began to get crazy as the story went viral on social media, and public warnings were issued, and to this day, no one is real sure where they came from. Some speculate that it was a movie promotion, others speculate some kind of internet challenge, while others suggest more dark reasons. But one we have never discussed, and one that lands the conspiracy here, is the 2016 clown sightings were a psychological experiment by the government. According to the theory, the government, or whatever entity, could have engineered the entire thing to observe how populations react to manufactured threats, especially in a time like now where misinformation can spread quickly. But why would they want to know this? One of the big reasons could be just to see how fast fear can spread and how quickly a community reacts to it. Maybe they wanted to see how far things would go before ordinary citizens decided to take matters into their own hands. Because remember, reportedly, there were citizens that attacked the individuals dressed as clowns. Likewise, it's possible the alphabet agencies could have just wanted to study how fear might influence decision making, or maybe they wanted to see if fear gripped a town or community, would it cause them to come together and act as one. And it's even possible the local governments were left out of the loop completely, and maybe this was actually tests just designed to measure the response times and see how they would handle such threats. Although there is no proof that the government is involved, it does sort of seem like an MKUltra type project. Much like shamanism we discussed earlier in the video, divination is another ritual that has been practiced over many centuries and many cultures. And although there are numerous ways to do it, whether that be tarot cards, reading a crystal ball, or tea leaf reading, the goal is the same. It's an attempt to try and predict the future, to prophesize. And while it used to be more popular in ancient times, many people to this day still believe in it, with lots of people going to see a fortune teller or talking to a psychic. But to the larger community as a whole, it's usually viewed as sort of a magic trick and nothing else. And skeptics completely dismiss the practice. But what if it actually works? What if there are some people born with a gift to see the future? And I know you might be saying, if that was true, why aren't their predictions more accurate then? That's where the conspiracy, butterfly susceptibility comes in. According to this, once one's future has been predicted to them, it will begin to influence the way one acts, and what their decisions will be from that point. A person may, in response to a bad prophecy, begin to alter their behavior to pursue a more favorable outcome. Because of this, the timeline changes, and these small changes cause a ripple effect which alters the future and thus makes the original prediction no longer true. The whole theory kinda makes divination a paradox, but it would still mean divination is actually a legit thing. When it comes to plagues, there are maybe none more devastating than the Black Death, which killed an estimated 50% of people living in Europe in the 14th century. It spread around in the years of 1346 to 1353, and is one of the most important events in European history. I mean, it's really hard to just try and convey how really awful it was and the long-term effects it caused, ranging from cultural to economic. It is believed now that it was caused by a bacteria that was spread by fleas as well as could be transferred through the air. But what if that was just a lie? Because according to this conspiracy, the Bubonic Plague was actually caused by, you guessed it, aliens. Now why and how did they go about doing this? Well, that's the tricky part, and where the whole theory splits off in different directions. Some people believe the plague was caused by malicious intent, while others believe it was accidental. We'll start with the latter first. According to this one, the aliens visited sometime in the 14th century, and did so out of curiosity or possibly to help humanity, and in doing so, inadvertently unleashed a disease. Maybe it was something their bodies had become immune to. It's basically like the old world explorers passing on smallpox to the Native Americans, while the ones who take the opposite viewpoint believe that it was done intentionally. They believe the aliens visited somewhere in Europe around the time period and released it on purpose as a means of population control, or maybe to steal resources, or possibly so they could study it as an experiment. If that was the case, it's sometimes suggested they accomplished this by spreading the disease via the smoke or gas that is sometimes reported to be emitting from the aircraft. Of course, we have no historical accounts to say anything about alien beings arriving to Earth, although there are some accounts of UFOs. I think we have all heard the argument that, with the way things work almost perfectly with one another on Earth and within the universe, that random chance alone could not be responsible, and that a higher power created the Earth or the entire universe in a manner which would flow smoothly. And that creator really depends on your faith, but we will just say God. And since we know God is a perfect being, then it's only logical to think he would not create a universe with unnecessary things. There would be no redundancy whatsoever, and in fact, he would be and is an efficient universe. And since we know that, then we can also pretty much discern that everything in it serves some kind of meaningful purpose, especially humanity, which the world was built around. In fact, Genesis 1:27 says mankind was created in the image of God, which implies we have some unique relationship with the divine, which means we also have a purpose. And that's where this conspiracy comes in. Maybe mankind's ultimate goal is to learn everything about the universe, from understanding the laws of nature to exploring the vastness of space. Think of it as a class, one where we learn everything about the bubble we have been put into. And let's take it a step further. What happens when mankind knows all? Well, see, that's where this conspiracy goes. Once mankind has exhausted all the mysteries of creation, and we have reached our full potential, then that's when our purpose has been fulfilled, and things will be brought to a conclusion, or as the Bible says, the rapture, which of course is when the faithful believers are taken up to heaven at the end of times. But this conspiracy suggests that the rapture might actually be our transition from this temporary existence on Earth to an eternal divine reality. Of course, the major issue with this one is, I don't even think it's possible we could ultimately learn everything. How would we even explore the very distant galaxies? I think it's interesting, but probably not likely. The French Viper releases is a conspiracy/urban legend that has been around for decades, but is not well known here in the States. But basically, the theory revolves around the idea of these large numbers of Vipers that have been released into the countryside of France for some nefarious reasons. Now, just who did this is a mystery. It's often said to be it's one of the shadow groups in the government doing it, possibly an attempt to use dangerous wildlife as means of population control. But it's also been suggested that it could be part of a secret biological experiment of some kind. Interestingly, sometimes the theory adds in that people have even seen black helicopters over these areas tossing the Vipers out, which of course would be indicative of a government agency helicopter of some kind. The next group that is often mentioned is eco-terrorists. These activists are allegedly releasing huge numbers of venomous snakes into rural areas to stop or slow down deforestation, or maybe to put a stop to mining, maybe even just the general stopping of human infrastructure moving into an area and removing the natural habitats of many animals. Of course, just like a lot of these conspiracies, there's no real proof that's ever been documented for this, and as far as the government covert angle with the helicopters go, it's pretty implausible, because snakes aren't really built to take falls, so being tossed from a helicopter would probably kill them, or at least injure them pretty badly, which would kinda defeat the purpose. But what really goes against this one is, France is home to a few different species of vipers, the asp and the European adder in particular. They're seen quite often in the rural areas and mountains, especially in the summer, and due to the habitat changes, or droughts, or even the population of their prey, it wouldn't be surprising that some years you may stumble across more vipers than normal, and it's believed this might be the origin of the conspiracy. On this channel, we have covered numerous paranormal mysteries in the past, ranging from the Hat Man watching you sleep to the ghost caught in your peripheral vision, and it's this conspiracy next that might explain it all, because according to this theory, the reason there are so many ghost sightings is because, well, Earth is really purgatory. Purgatory, in case you don't know, is a belief in Catholicism for all those that die in God's grace but are not yet purified. So your soul goes to purgatory, where a process of purification begins, and then once holiness is achieved, you will enter into heaven. So with that understanding, could Earth be the location of this so-called purgatory? The theory works on the premise that these paranormal experiences, largely ones that revolve around ghost sightings, are really just the souls harboring here until they enter heaven. The idea is not that crazy when you consider that the believers of the paranormal already suggest something similar. To many ghost hunters, they believe spirits left on Earth are here due to unfinished business, unresolved trauma, or just souls trapped here between this world and wherever they are supposed to go next. So in this theory, then ghost sightings are nothing more than souls going through an extended period of purification before entering heaven. And the theory takes it a step further and suggests that every virtuous soul that died before Jesus is somehow stuck permanently in purgatory, which explains why there were so many supernatural occurrences in the Bible before Jesus versus how uncommon they are these days. Maybe these divine interventions, and especially angels, were really souls stuck here in purgatory and were only released after Christ's sacrifice made a way for the souls to enter heaven. This next one may be a controversial one, but actually doesn't seem to be too far-fetched. That is, 4chan is a psyop with the goal to create a perfect hive mind. 4chan, for the few that don't know, allows one to post anonymously with little to no moderation, which of course lends itself to some posters being edgy and controversial. Because of this, over time, the boards on the site begin to become their own community, with inside jokes and memes that other boards may not share, although some of the jokes and memes are site-wide. But since the majority of users post anonymously, there's no way to track a person post to post, and without consistent moderation, other anonymous users begin to try and fit in and also post the same memes and inside jokes in order to blend in, or better yet, to avoid being trolled. This results in a form of groupthink, or a hive mind. Furthermore, this hive mind leads to the absence of any dissenting viewpoints on the board, since they will only be trolled if they post something outside the hive mind. This leads to an echo chamber, which just reinforces the hive mind, and the posters on the site soon don't even realize how much their thoughts are just being formed by the collective's thoughts. With all that being said, who's behind it? Again, you get your standard boogeymen, the government, or some shadow group inside, or possibly even a corporation. But why are they doing it? Well, the obvious answer is to manipulate and shape public opinion on human behavior. Maybe it's a testing ground to show how easily people's beliefs can be swayed, or how online disinformation can be spread. Others even suggest the whole site serves as nothing more than a way to study herd behavior, to see how people can be so easily influenced to take on extreme views. Or maybe it's a way to learn how people become part of a group without even realizing it. Maybe QAnon, which originated there, is an example of how effective it can be. Interestingly, the site is home to many alt-right conspiracies, with many using this to separate themselves from mainstream views. So ironically, if it is a psyop, the users might actually be serving the opposite purpose. Instead of rebelling against society, they are unknowingly aligning with someone else's agenda. This one is probably not far from the truth. All throughout history, and basically over every culture, folktales were told about hideous creatures and beings that could be hiding in the woods, ready to jump out on the first victim that comes by. Whether this was a vampire or a werewolf, the stories are not uncommon to our ancient ancestors, and likewise, there were many ways to stop these various mythical creatures. But what if they were not mythical at all? This theory suggests that at one point in history, some of these paranormal creatures that were said to lurk the night really existed, hence why there are so many stories about them. Take vampires for instance. They appear in folklore from Europe, Asia, and Africa, and although they are a little different, they share a lot and are pretty much the same creatures. They are undead or demonic, and they prey on the living by draining their blood. Suspected vampires were often beheaded or had a stake driven through the body, or sometimes burned, while garlic was thought to keep them at bay. So if they were found over numerous cultures, could it have been grounded in some truth? Maybe the knowledge of the methods spread throughout the old world and was passed down over the centuries, and over time, the vampire population was wiped out. It's even possible that at certain points in history, groups of people went around trying to find and massacre them, maybe by the order of a king or religious authority, or heck, maybe organized by the community itself. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility. Don't forget, there were witch hunts after all, and maybe now we look back at this piece of history as nothing more than superstition, while back then it was a very real threat. But this doesn't strictly adhere to vampires. It could also be other monsters, like werewolves. Again, here's a so-called creature that we all know its weakness, that of silver. Whether that be a bullet or blade, silver will kill a werewolf, and they are also afraid of holy symbols. So I ask you, is this just history's way of writing tall tales, or did mankind really perform genocide on vampires and the like? In the late 1960s, Americans would see an influx of European and Japanese cars begin to hit the market. These vehicles were way more fuel efficient than anything being produced in America at the time, and due to this, it put a lot of pressure on the homegrown companies, who would also begin development of their own fuel-efficient models, and one of these would go down notoriously as a dangerous vehicle, and is went on to serve as a textbook case for unethical business practices. That's right, I'm talking about the Ford Pinto and the scandal around it. Now I'm not going to deep dive on its history or anything, because that's not important to our first conspiracy, but basically, Ford rushed the development of the car, getting it developed in about half the time that it usually takes, and right away it was found that this car was extremely dangerous in the event of a rear-end collision, because the gas tank, it would often rupture and explode or catch fire, putting the passengers at risk. And it didn't even have to be high-impact crashes. It could happen at slow speeds of 20 miles per hour. Now the catch was, internal Ford documents were eventually released to the public, which showed Ford knew this was an issue. But to send out recall notices and spend $11 to correct the issue, well, it was simply way more expensive to do that than to just respond to the lawsuits. That's right, according to Ford's estimate, it would have taken $137 million to replace that part on every Pinto on the market, whereas responding to lawsuits would have cost way less. So they said, who cares how many people get hurt or die in these fires? Which, by the way, there are different estimates on. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration stated they found 27 deaths that could link to the fires caused by the Pinto, while other independent investigations found that it numbered up in the hundreds, while Ford themselves estimated it would have saved 180 lives a year and another 180 severe burn injuries. The fallout didn't help Ford's image, which was now seen as an extremely greedy company willing to sacrifice lives to save money. And I'm not just picking on Ford here, because there's a ton of companies who have done questionable things to save money, like using smear campaigns and fake scandals against would-be whistleblowers to make their claims look ridiculous, while every legal loophole conceivable has been used to cripple competitors, journalists, and just about anyone who gets in the company's way. There's even been attempts at blackmailing people to earn their silence, but it leads to this first conspiracy that if these corporations are willing to go this far, what else could they be guilty of? Is it possible these companies have kill lists? According to the theory, at the top of these companies, where the real decision makers meet, a kill list is kept of all their enemies, who need to be dealt with in more extreme measures, like assassination. For example, let's say someone who would be around the mid-corporate level discovers a flaw that would set back production of a project and cost millions of dollars to fix. This person brings it to the attention of the decision makers at that company, who ignore it. He in turn feels he must go to the press because this flaw could result in deaths of anyone who uses the product. The CEO and other members of the board then just put this person on their list and begin shopping around for a mercenary. And then one day, the would-be whistleblower falls out of a window accidentally and the flaw is forgotten about. Or let's say, two company rivals are competing to take over the whole market, and things like corporate espionage begins, and before long, an assassin working for Company A infiltrates the upper echelon of Company B, and soon, the most important person at Company B gets murdered in an unfortunate robbery attempt. Or maybe someone is trying to stop a company merger which will lay off hundreds of people, and this person has an unfortunate accident on their way home due to the loss of their brakes, which ends in their death. This theory is actually not that far-fetched due to so many corporate scandals in the past, like the Ford Pinto, and also due to the fact that many of these corporations hide the decision-making at the upper levels, which just leads to more conspiracies. And heck, there are documented cases of companies using violence on employees who are striking, so it's not that far out of the realm of possibility. But there's never been any proof that any kill list actually exists, and it's probably far more effective and less risky to just use good PR and lawyers to fight off would-be enemies. Ever since the dawn of man, numerous soothsayers and prophets have preached about the coming of the end of days, a time when the world, or at least mankind, will end. It's found in some religions, especially Christianity, and, unsurprisingly, many people today believe we are living in the end times, but this next conspiracy suggests that the end days have already occurred, and humanity ended. Now, the theory divulges a little bit here, but we'll take a look at a couple of the more popular ones. And since we have already discussed Christianity, let's look at that angle first. The rapture is an event that believers and practicers of the faith are taken to heaven, which leaves the rest of humanity to face tribulation, a period that occurs before the second coming of Christ. Some conspiracy theorists, especially ones that are more spiritual-minded, believe that this has already occurred and no one has recognized it yet, although they will often cite perceived moral and spiritual decline in mankind, hence the reason. And I know you may be thinking, but none of these Christians have been taken to heaven yet, so doesn't that rule this one out? Well, according to the believers of this theory, it is possible that the faithful may have been removed without a huge dramatic event taking place, like their souls may have ascended to heaven, leaving their bodies here, which have blended in and not tipped anyone off to the rapture taking place. The next take on the world has already ended conspiracy ties in with the simulation hypothesis, and I know you have heard of that. It's the idea that our reality is actually a computer simulation and none of this is real, and instead, we are being watched and studied by a far more intelligent species who designed the simulation. However, in this version of the theory, the creators of the simulation were actually us. Yes, at one point, when mankind reached its technological apex, he was able to create these simulated realities, and that proved to be fortunate because Earth would be hit with some kind of disaster that destroyed everything. Maybe it was nuclear war, or a comet smashing Earth, or maybe even an alien invasion. The reason is not important. What is, was this technology was used by humanity to load ourselves into a virtual environment that would survive this catastrophic event. That is supposed to explain things like deja vu or the Mandela effect. It can even explain instances of weird phenomena, which is supposed to be because the simulation is not perfect and can sometimes produce errors. Bohemian Grove is a rabbit hole full of conspiracies that I'm sure many of you have already heard about. It's basically a campsite used by the world's elite that is shrouded in secrecy. It's a 2,700-acre private campground in Monte Rio, California, which is owned by the Bohemian Club and has members from the political world as well as the business world and some types of media. It's a place where photography is banned, but there have been leaked photos, as well as information. They meet for 2 weeks every year in mid-July, where it's guarded by ex-military personnel with high-end security equipment, such as thermal and night vision goggles and vibration-sensing alarm systems. Add in the fact that we have no idea what they meet about, and you can see why. There is so much speculation about it that arises. This was only amped up more by conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, who was able to infiltrate and shoot footage of one of their ceremonies, one that Jones later on claimed was a ritual sacrifice, although others have claimed it is nothing more than a frat party. But we could go on all day about what it is the Bohemian Grove is allegedly doing, but that's not the conspiracy on this one. Instead, we are going to talk about the location. One wonders why a place that has drawn so much publicity and potentially made themselves targets to some crazy person that wants to get in and cause harm. Why meet at a place like this when you could just move it somewhere else? I mean, the safest and most secretive thing they could do would be to move the annual meeting to a different location every year. And considering these people are extremely wealthy, it wouldn't be an issue to do it, which leads to the theory that these annual meetings must happen at this location for a reason, and that reason is most likely spiritual or occult. Perhaps it's the presence of ley lines, something we have discussed before. These are straight lines that connect the sacred sites around the world, such as Stonehenge and the pyramids. These lines overlap at points and allegedly create so-called power points that are believed to be spiritually charged, and because of that, any ritual performed at one of these locations ends up being amplified. And of course, Bohemian Grove is supposed to lie at one of these locations, and that's why it cannot be moved to different places every year, because for the rituals to work, they must be performed here. Another take on this theory suggests that Bohemian Grove is actually located on sacred indigenous land, and it is true that it was once inhabited by a few different groups, specifically the Pomo, Coast Miwok, and Wapo peoples. These tribes attributed much spiritual significance to natural features in the area, such as rivers, trees, and yes, groves. Specifically, the redwood forest of Bohemian Grove. Many of the tribes regarded the old growth trees as sacred beings, which symbolize strength, longevity, and their connection to the cosmos. So a grove of these trees in a secluded location, like Bohemian Grove, would be used as a ceremonial site for rituals just for that reason, because some of these indigenous groups believed rituals performed at the same location could lead to that place becoming saturated with this spiritual energy. So performing these rituals every year at a place that already holds special power due to the redwood groves, and add in the fact that these rituals go back hundreds of years, well, it's like maxing out the energy of this location for the elite who attends. One of the most popular groups that seems to come up time and time again in the conspiracy world is the Illuminati. They are supposed to be this shadow group of elites controlling world events by manipulating governments, economies, and powerful individuals to further their own power and dominance. I mean, I don't really have to say much more than that, because I know you all know what the Illuminati is. But what if we're all wrong? That's the theme to this next conspiracy, that the Illuminati are actually the good guys. The idea behind this one is that the Illuminati's secret control of global events is not a quest for power. Instead, it's a necessary thing they must do to prevent humanity from spiraling into chaos. They hide behind the scenes, using their power to guide the world toward a more sustainable future, and therefore are protectors, not oppressors. Some versions take this theory further and speculate that the Illuminati are actually working to guard humanity from alien threats or other supernatural forces that the average person could never understand or even conceive of. This one also suggests that the Illuminati keeps everything hidden because the public cannot handle the truth, and it falls back on an argument that we have heard so many times in this series, that if the truth came out about aliens trying to invade Earth, it would cause panic. So while their decisions look evil to us outsiders, actually, it's the only way we can survive long term, and they are actually the misunderstood heroes thrust into their unthankful roles. Of course, some still argue if they are truly doing good work for humanity, there would be no reason to hide it. The Maya, Khmer Rouge, Indus Valley Civilization, Easter Island, and the Mississippians. What do these cultures have in common? That's right, they are all known as lost civilizations. They are kingdoms and cities that reached unprecedented heights during their time and then vanished, leaving little clue as to what had happened. The Maya may be the most famous example of this in the West. They dominated Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Mexico before it suddenly declined around 900 AD, and nobody is sure why, although it may have been war with a mix of climate change that resulted in famine. There's also one that was located right here in America, that of the Mississippian culture, whose gigantic city, Cahokia, in Illinois, just started declining quickly and vanished within a short span of time, with some theories suggesting disease and environmental degradation leading to famine. But what if there's a darker reason all of these advanced civilizations just vanished? That brings us to the theory that lost civilizations are concluded experiments. According to this one, the world is nothing more than a laboratory where some secret society is controlling and studying experiments known as civilization. These elites vary depending on the theory and are sometimes presented as these advanced alien beings or ancient entities, or possibly the remnants of a previous human civilization with very advanced knowledge. And their goals, again depending on which version you hear about, could be to test different government systems, or to study society structures, or possibly just to study human behavior under certain conditions. And the way it allegedly works in this group, whoever it is, use their advanced knowledge to guide the rise and fall of a civilization. Maybe they provide one group of people with the right knowledge to technologically advance quicker than the others, leading to powerful empires, and once they are done with the experiment and ready to wrap it up, they cause the decline of the empire, either by instigating wars or causing some kind of natural disaster, maybe even climate change, to speed up the fall. And during all this, they study human resilience and survival. But just when do they choose to conclude these experiments? That usually comes when a civilization begins to stagnate, or fails to achieve certain goals that was already chosen by this group. And once the civilization has failed due to war or instability or some kind of disaster, this secret society destroys physical records, monuments, and oral histories, so future societies cannot learn much from them. Maybe this is what happened to the Indus Valley civilization, or maybe this might explain why the monuments were left behind at the Mayan civilization, because the secret society was not able to fully erase them. Likewise, it could explain why Atlantis, a highly advanced civilization, was destroyed and erased. Maybe it grew too powerful for this secret society's agenda. The theory even goes into our time and suggests the elite are experimenting with one global civilization, testing humanity's ability to function as one entity, and they test us with wars, economic collapses, and pandemics. But why? Why do any of this, assuming it's true? Well, this theory is a lot like the simulation theory, where our reality is running in the digital world and is being studied, except in this theory, it's all real. And in this case, it could also just be because they want to study us, or maybe, calling on the Illuminati theory from earlier, they are doing this to preserve humanity by seeking a way to build the perfect society. So we have already discussed internet conspiracy once in this series, when we discussed how the government controlled the deep web, but the segregated internet theory takes a little twist on that one, and instead suggests that the real global internet is heavily controlled and divided into certain layers that are available to certain people, and that the average person will never be given access to the true internet. Instead, depending on varying circumstances like the area you live in, your age, race, gender, sexual orientation, economic class, and maybe even your perceived intellectual level, will determine what part of the internet you are able to see, because it has all been sanitized and tailored just to you, and you will never leave that bubble. Because of this, the internet service provider, working with the government, start to filter out or limit what you may see, again, depending on the aforementioned characteristics you may have. And it doesn't sound completely implausible, as we have a real-life example of this, China's Great Firewall, which shields the entire country. But is it actually possible to block off certain parts of the web for every individual user? That would be a bit more difficult to pull off. So that's when the theory expands and suggests some internet sites are also working along with this big scheme, and they too suggest or drowned out sites, which again specifically tailors it all to you. But the theory gets even more intriguing because we all know about the deep web, but what if there was a hidden internet that was only accessible to the elite? And on this internet is unfiltered knowledge about what's really going on in the world, along with seeing uncensored communication between the real power brokers who run the world. Speaking of, while the elite are accessing the hidden internet, talking to the most powerful people in the world, well, your internet is mostly bots. That guy you're arguing with on social media is nothing but a bot to keep you occupied so you don't sniff out the real scheme taking place right under your nose. And these bots are everywhere from comment sections to forums, and now even customer service, leaving us many times to feel like it's just us occupying this space on the web. It gets even worse when you consider that on the segregated internet, you also have some platforms that are charging to be a participant, which basically reinforces segregation based on your socioeconomic status. Which brings us to the next point. If the internet can be split up like this, and tailored specifically to you, is it also possible your internet speed is intentionally throttled? Or what about its availability? Is it possible your connection going down is not the sign of bad weather or poor infrastructure, but instead you have been intentionally put in timeout for something you said on the web, something that went against the powers that be? And maybe that happened when you were in one of your echo chambers that was again suggested to you in your bubble. Maybe 4chan is not the home of free speech that you think it is, and instead you're being directed there because it's easier to subvert and control you in that hive mind, a place to reinforce your beliefs while hiding opposing viewpoints, further isolating you from the real internet. So I'm sure the majority of you have heard the theory that professional sports is all scripted and the winners are predetermined. That's a pretty old conspiracy, and it's argued that it can be traced back to the bread and circuses policy of the Romans, which sounds exactly like you think. By providing distractions for the public with constant entertainment, everyone forgets about real political or social issues. They instead focus on the games and rivalries and do not worry about what the government is doing. And it's easy to see why people would believe that. First of all, it's the structures of these leagues. You get rivalries like the Yankees and Dodgers, who met in the World Series this year. You have those dramatic comeback victories that keep you glued to the last second. While we also occasionally see the underdog team, who had no chance to win, pull off the shocker of the year, upsetting the best team in the league. It's almost too good to be true, like a Hollywood script. Then, there are the questionable referee calls that can completely change the outcome of a game, and actually gives the appearance that the refs wanted this certain team to win. And maybe that's true, because maybe they are pushing for a more marketable result, like the popular team winning or the popular star player shining. But as I mentioned, you've probably already heard this theory. I'm wanting to discuss a more controversial one. What if professional sports is not only a bread and circuses routine, but it's also built in such a way that it allows major money laundering to take place? Look at the player contracts alone, which can go up into the hundreds of millions, and that doesn't even include sponsorships, while the teams and their owners also get broadcasting deals and merchandising. Speaking of owners, they can really abuse the system, because some of the money used for their players and investments in facilities come from offshore accounts, and that data is not made public. And I don't even need to bring up gambling, which is a perfect way to launder money that has been earned illicitly, because all this laundered money can just be disguised as gambling wins. Not to mention, there have been professional teams allegedly linked to organized crime, and some have been involved in match fixing. Maybe the most well-known one to me is the Black Sox scandal in which the 1919 World Series seen the Chicago White Sox intentionally lose in exchange for a payment from a gambling syndicate that might have been led by mob boss Arnold Rothstein. But it's not limited to sports of the old days, as the 2006 Series A scandal in Italy showed, in which Italy's top professional soccer league was involved in a scandal that saw the top teams working with refs to guarantee their victories, at a price of course, which just leads to many fans of other sports wondering, could the NFL have the same thing going on? Are all the players, coaches, and referees working together to throw games, not only for gambling, but to help some powerful people launder dirty money around? That's the conspiracy. I probably don't have to tell you what Jonestown is, since it is such a well-known tragedy, but I will sum it up for those who may have been living under a rock. Jonestown was led by a man named Jim Jones, who was a self-proclaimed reverend, but is really known for being a cult leader. In 1977, facing pressure from San Francisco media, they went to Guyana and created a settlement called Jonestown, and it would end in disaster when on November 18, 1978, a total of 918 people died. 909 of those died in Jonestown itself, and all but 2 of them died from cyanide poisoning, in which a significant number were forced to take it against their will. And of course, Congressman Leo Ryan was sent there to investigate the cult and was murdered at the behest of Jim Jones. But you all know this. We are going to discuss 2 of the more popular conspiracies that surround these events. The first, and maybe most famous, is the whole thing was a part of CIA's MKUltra program, which conducted mind control experiments. As we discussed before, it was top secret, and its goals were aimed at learning how to do mind control and chemical manipulation using drugs like LSD. And because of Jim Jones' strong influence over his followers, and because of all the strange behavior going on at the cult, this whole thing may have been a test run for the CIA. The reasoning for this belief is Jim Jones had a background using some of the techniques close to what the CIA was using, like sleep deprivation, forced confessions, and psychological manipulation. He also gave weird, almost hypnotic-like speeches that could be seen as one of these mind control techniques. And maybe unsurprisingly, Jones also gave drugs to the People's Temple members, including LSD. Finally, Jones had some relationships with the government. For one, he was a political activist who did meet some powerful people, including politicians. The next theory involving Jonestown is the US government played a direct role in causing the massacre, all to silence Jim Jones and his followers. A big part of this had to do with Jones's announcement that they desired to move to the Soviet Union. Since he was a follower of Marxist ideology and was quite critical of US policies, he wanted to go to the Soviet Union because he seen it as a socialist paradise, although he also looked at going to North Korea. But because of these reasons, he was no doubt a target for US intelligence agencies, and he was probably watched closely, as the government would have considered him a liability or threat since the size of his group had become quite significant. To this day, the official account is that it was a mass suicide triggered by the visit of Congressman Leo Ryan. However, this conspiracy suggests that the US government had to move in and cover up what was seen as a growing threat. Some take the alternate view and suggest that the government had an interest in ensuring that Jones's influence and knowledge about certain issues never became public, and thus a state-sanctioned execution was ordered, while others claim that Jonestown was a small part in a much larger and much more secret operation, and that this was an experiment gone wrong, and that the CIA was trying to test the limits of control over large groups of people, and it blew up in their faces. We've all heard the stories about gang stalking. It's this belief held by some that they are being harassed and watched by a network of people. These people are often just going about their day as an ordinary citizen, well, according to them at least, but to the victims of gang stalking, they believe these so-called ordinary citizens are part of a much larger surveillance operation, usually set up by the government or some other powerful organization. The interactions can be subtle too, like someone just passing by the victim on the street, or simply making casual conversation, which leads to the person believing even more that it's part of the gang stalking operation. They also claim that these people act in unusual ways, like saying key phrases or mimicking the victim's actions. Sometimes they claim vehicles are following them, or electronic devices are being used to track them, and that includes streetlights. Now, before I get into this conspiracy, the belief that one is a gang stalking victim is largely seen as a mental illness, tied very closely to extreme paranoia. And these people they claim are stalking them are really just people going about their day, and will often say they have no idea why they are being accused of stalking this person. But that brings us to the conspiracy theory. What if the gang stalking victims do not suffer from mental illness? And what if the people allegedly stalking them really have no idea why they are accusing them of gang stalking? That is the theory known as gang stalkers are unwilling participants. Basically, it suggests that the stalkers are being psychologically controlled remotely. They somehow or another have been manipulated or coerced into harassing or spying on other citizens, but they are completely unaware of it. Allegedly, some covert operation is using some form of this manipulation, or maybe even some kind of advanced technology we just don't know about, and they are controlling the stalkers, sorta like a drone, where they then begin participating in seemingly everyday activities, but have no idea why. And the victims, well, of course, they are seen as a threat to the government, or elite, or whatever group is behind it, and so they have to keep an eye on them. And what better way to do so than to use other citizens without their knowledge? Others believe it may be nothing more than some kind of large social experiment, or maybe some form of population control, while the final theory is that it could be used to influence public opinion, suppressing dissent, or maintaining control over certain individuals who could upset the established order. If you are only a casual conspiracy observer, I would still bet you have heard of the Clinton body doubles conspiracy. It's one that's been around since the mid-90s and basically suggests that the Clintons, Bill in the 90s and Hillary in the 2000s, both resorted to using body doubles. And why they did this is for different reasons. The big one for Bill is obviously the Monica Lewinsky scandal. The stress overwhelmed him and made him look tired and weak, and he wanted to hide that from the public. While Hillary, during her election campaign, was suggested to have used a body double when many started noticing how sick she looked, and even at one point looking like she fainted. But there are other reasons. The most understandable one is safety. Possibly when the Secret Service receives a reputable tip about someone who wants to harm the president, but then they can't find this person, so they use a body double just to be safe. But to be fair, this is not strictly a Clinton thing. In fact, pretty much every president of the last 50 years has been accused of having body doubles at one point or another, and that's because it's not a conspiracy. In fact, the correct term is political decoy, and it's been around forever, going back to Emperor Augustus of Rome, who is believed to have used body doubles for dangerous public situations where he feared assassination attempts. So now that we have established this was not just a Clinton thing, nor was it recent, I also have to point out that it don't only apply to politicians and world leaders. Many power brokers and members of the elite have been known to hire body doubles, billionaires, CEOs, and so on and so on. Because of all this, it takes finding someone that has a close physical resemblance to you, and then paying them enough money to take the risk. There's even been occasions where the decoy will undergo plastic surgery to look almost identical, and oftentimes they are even trained to speak and behave like the target. But we are discussing the crazy conspiracies here, so we have to spice this one up. And basically the theory is, these so-called body doubles of the Clintons, and all the others, are not body doubles, but instead, clones. According to this theory, the technology to clone humans has been around since the 90s, although some say 80s because there's a whole separate conspiracy that Ronald Reagan died in his assassination attempt in 1981, and then his clone was used for the next 7 years. Regardless of which, the cloning technology was hidden from the general public, or sometimes it's even suggested it wasn't cloning, but the transferring of human consciousness, and when a political figure is in danger of dying, the consciousness is transferred to the clone, replacing the original person and allowing them to continue on in public life. And of course, this is all being hid so they can keep the power in just a few hands. So yeah, that's pretty much all on this one. Every president has a clone waiting on standby to go in at any time, and they are also available to have the consciousness transferred to them, thereby completely removing any need for a vice president. At some point during the late 1970s, an exact date I could not find, a small comic book would begin finding its way into numerous school children's hands across the country. But it wasn't an exciting comic book full of superheroes and capes. Instead, it was a boring financial comic book, one that was published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. This comic was called The Road to Ruta, Wishes and Rainbows, and it was, and is still, used to teach children about the basic principles of markets, economics, and scarcity. The plot follows a little girl named Ruta who lives in a town called Pebbleton that exists underground and is inhabited by tiny people. The strangest part, though, is in Pebbleton, there is no color. Instead, it's a world made up of grayscale. But the people of Pebbleton have heard the legends of the people of Colorland, but they have never been there. And long story short, Ruta, while playing in a cave, finds an entrance to Colorland, and for the first time sees the gold from the sunlight. She also finds these pretty flowers that, of course, are colorful, which she takes back to her grandmother, and then the two end up taking it to the middle of Pebbleton and planting them, which leads to all these citizens of Pebbleton wanting their own colorful flowers. The mayor eventually sends Ruta to go back and get more, but a rock slide has now blocked the entrance of Colorland. But she continues to search for a long time and finds a hole in the ceiling of the cave way up in the air, and no one in Pebbleton can get to it. But thankfully, the golden sunlight is coming through, and Ruta has an idea. The flower in Pebbleton is dying at this point from lack of sunlight, but it's rumored that the flower's tears can make new plants. So Ruta takes the tears and plants them in the sunlight and grows 3 new flowers, and then takes them back to town to find that everyone is now insisting they be the ones that get the first batch of flowers, and it makes Ruta fret because she cannot decide who should get the flowers first. And it's basically an allegory for market supply and demand, something that small children can understand, and it is seemingly pretty innocent. But there's a huge conspiracy around it, and crazily enough, our topic is not this conspiracy, but it does involve it. So I'll start with a brief summary of the conspiracy that surrounds the story before we get to the more obscure one. Basically, there are some people who believe that this comic book's real intent is to push the economic system we have now back to the gold reserve, and that Colorland is the gold standard, which is why golden sunlight hits Ruta immediately in the face after breaking out of Pebbleton. The theory was made by popular financial analyst Bix Weir, who believes that this indicates that there are hidden plans by the US elite, or maybe the world elite, to take us back to the gold standard, and that the comic book was all a coded message for others to see about the upcoming financial reforms, even claiming that Ruta's name is a pun on Root A, which stands for Return to a Root Standard, which is signaling a shift by the elite, as well as telling our children they should trust authority. Bix Weir further speculated that there were some good guys working for the Federal Reserve that are trying to collapse the fiat financial system so we can go back to a more honest gold standard system. And I can hear you right now, but I thought the elite, or Illuminati, or whatever secret shadow organization you want to use, wants us to stay in this evil, greedy fiat financial system, and that the gold standard is the pure, wholesome system us ordinary people want to go back to. So why is there a conspiracy about this comic book which claims there's a fight by the elite to take us back to the gold standard? Now that's where our conspiracy comes in, and it's one that makes a lot of sense, yet you don't hear it discussed often. What if there is infighting between the elite and these shadow organizations? I mean, that's human nature after all, and it's quite farcical to think that everyone in these powerful hidden groups would agree on everything. But conspiracy theorists never speculate on that, and instead suggest that these groups are working together 100% of the time, agreeing on everything. But that's where our theory comes in that maybe, just maybe, there is a lot of infighting going on. Maybe the Freemasons don't agree with the Illuminati on which economic system should be used, and they, along with other shadow groups, are battling for control. Or perhaps people within the deep state don't even agree with one another. The point is, that would be expected because that's just human nature. But it's because of this that the people who are not able to see behind the scenes, like us, have no idea what's going on. We don't see their battleground. Instead, we just see the fallout from it. Because media, entertainment, public messaging, basically everything in pop culture ends up becoming their battleground where they try and influence us or sway our opinion on these key issues, which they are having disputes over themselves, suggesting that we are nothing but pawns in their proxy war. You may remember on the previous part of this series, we covered the theory that no conspiracy is true, which basically alleges that every conspiracy on YouTube or anywhere on the internet or in books or any that are public knowledge are all fake to throw us off what is really going on behind the scenes. This next one is called All Conspiracies Are True, which as the name implies, every conspiracy you have heard of is true, regardless of how ridiculous it sounds, or even if it contradicts other conspiracies, there's some element of truth to it. It's basically the suggestion that the universe is far more complex and deceptive than we can comprehend, and since every reality is at least according to some hypothesis, layered with infinite timelines and dimensions, then in at least one of these realities, a conspiracy we have heard must be true somewhere. While a similar twist plays off quantum mechanics by suggesting that if enough people believe in a conspiracy, it can collapse the wave function of reality, which then makes it real in a sense, which is kind of a way to cheat on this one, since it suggests that not every conspiracy is actually happening on one version of Earth. However, there are some that believe that that is the case, and how it works is that the governments, secret societies, and other powerful entities are so adept at manipulating information that they are able to create false narratives which hide truths by surrounding them with absurdities, making even the craziest conspiracy partially real. While others believe the contradictory conspiracies like Flat Earth and Hollow Earth are intentionally working together to prevent anyone from really learning the truth, which is a conspiracy unto itself. Or maybe that the moon landing really did happen, but they staged large parts of it for nefarious reasons. Regardless of which you believe, if all conspiracies are true, it could suggest we are living in a simulation, or maybe a multiverse, where some of these ideas coexist across dimensions. Or maybe it would suggest that these hidden rulers do exist. Aliens, the Illuminati, lizard people, and AI overlords all hold power over us, either collaborating or competing, as we referenced in the last theory. Furthermore, if every conspiracy is true, then it's almost impossible to say what our true reality is, which is maybe the goal all along, and again is another conspiracy to distract us from the real truth. That one made my head hurt. Maybe the most disenfranchised culture in Europe that you have never heard of was a group of people who lived on the border of France and Spain and were known as the K.G.O. These peoples were in the area by at least 1000 AD, yet no one knows where they came from. But by the 16th or 17th century, they became treated terribly. They faced severe discrimination and were often forced to live isolated from the other citizens of the area. And for some reason, still unknown to this day, they were often associated with physical and social stigmas, despite the fact that they looked nor acted differently than the people who lived around them. Yet, they were still forced to live away from the towns, and they were banned from marrying anyone other than another K.G.O., and they were not allowed to have certain jobs, and instead were only allowed to be carpenters, masons, woodcutters, wood carvers, butcher, and rope maker, and sometimes they let them be musicians. They were not allowed to enter taverns, nor use public fountains, and they had to be buried in separate cemeteries, and they could only go into church using a special door, and once inside, they had to sit separately from the other worshippers, and thankfully, they put up rails so the K.G.O. would know where they were supposed to sit. So obviously, they weren't allowed to be priests either. They often were forced to wear a red representation of a goose's foot, which was sewn into their clothing, although by 1623, they were also required to wear cloaks with a yellow trim which would identify them. Now what makes this crazy is, their only distinction between them and their neighbors was their name. The families long identified themselves as the K.G.O., Other than that, they looked and acted like everyone else in the area, which is kind of bizarre because no one knows why this is. Historians have not been able to track down their origin point either, which, if determined, could hint at why they were discriminated against. Although there have been a lot of theories as to where they did come from. Some suggest they were the descendants of the Visigoths. Others suggest they were a leftover enclave from the Moorish peoples who were eventually driven out of Spain. Then, there are the more fanciful theories, like they were the descendants of a colony of lepers. And on that one, there was some blood testing done in the 1940s and 50s, which showed they were closer to being French than Spanish, which led to the theory that they were French migrants from leper colonies. Then we also have the religious theories that they were a guild of fallen carpenters whose descendants had built the cross that Jesus was crucified on. And speaking of, they were Christians and the same faith of everybody else around. And because of that, they petitioned the Pope in 1514 for better treatment. And in return, he issued a papal bull which stated they should be treated with kindness like all the other believers. But everyone just ignored this and still treated them like crap. This, of course, led to the N.U.G.E.T distancing themselves from their own culture, which we now know nothing about since it was practically erased. And by the 1920s, it was even difficult to find a N.U.G.E.T, as they were almost extinct, since many of them had been assimilated into the general population and did everything they could not to be identified as a descendant of the N.U.G.E.T. Still, by the 1950s, a small scandal hit France when a non-N.U.G.E.T woman married a N.U.G.E.T man. Today, there's very little evidence that they ever existed. But what in the world does this have to do with a conspiracy? That comes into play with a theory that the N.U.G.E.T were a part of a failed social or genetic experiment carried out by an ancient secret society that had worked behind the scenes for centuries. Maybe they were the precursor to the Illuminati, or maybe they still exist today. But what is known is they worked over decades experimenting on human populations, working to influence the rise and falls of nations, cultures, and genetic lines. This is sort of like the theory we covered earlier when we discussed the lost civilizations being concluded experiments. But in this one, they could have been testing the effects of isolation on a population to observe what happens after centuries of discrimination. So the group was systematically ostracized and isolated from larger society, where they were then observed to see how it affected the N.U.G.E.T as well as the larger population. The theory further elaborates that this very advanced secret society was then able to use memory wiping technology, which is why there are no clear records of where the N.U.G.E.T came from, as some kind of technology was used to erase every last trace of their existence from the official records, and even from the collective memory of society, which explains why over time, they began to fade from memory, and after the experiment was over, they were just absorbed into the general population with their unique heritage gone. Although, unfortunately for them, they were still subjected to lingering prejudice and discriminatory practices, possibly due to people having a subconscious cultural memory of them, which might explain why there was a scandal with the French woman marrying a N.U.G.E.T man in the 1950s, which again goes back to the study, and perhaps they are waiting to see how long it takes before the discrimination stops, even when there's no clear reason as to why they were supposed to be hated to begin with. But this brings us to the final part of this conspiracy. What if this wasn't just limited to the N.U.G.E.T? Is it possible entire regions or groups of people were also subjected to similar experiences, and then later these shadow groups who organized them erased everything about these peoples? And that could explain why some groups, despite appearing in historical records, appear to have no clear origin point, which could also mean that these people, cultures, and nations were also created by the same people that are controlling the trajectory of human society. In other words, the N.U.G.E.T are just one piece of the puzzle, and these other lost groups went through similar treatment before being erased, which also explains why certain languages and cultures have vanished. And if it's true that cultural amnesia exists, caused by memory wiping techniques, then it could explain why certain groups of people are still discriminated against today, even when there's no clear reason as to why, because it's in society's subconscious. Or maybe, just maybe, the secret society is still pulling the strings and waiting to see how modern society treats certain groups, and is possibly at some point going to erase their origin as well. Regardless, it's scary and a little depressing to think about. And maybe it was just an experiment, one performed over centuries by this secret powerful group. Or maybe we're just looking for an excuse for our own cruelty. If you follow the conspiracy world, you have no doubt heard of the machine elves. I know we have covered them before in previous videos, and basically, they're supposed to be these beings that are seen by people who ingest a psychedelic drug known as DMT. They are unsurprisingly usually described as looking like elves, but sometimes they are described as being alien, or looking like a mantis-type being. Actually, there's a ton of different descriptions, as it all depends on the person witnessing them, and they are often just watching you, although sometimes they do try to communicate, maybe offering wise words, or in some accounts, just being humorous. And depending on which source you believe, you're either just experiencing hallucinations, or, as the bigger conspiracy suggests, actually entering another dimension or plane of existence, where these humanoid-type beings exist. A dimension that can only be unlocked by taking DMT, which allegedly alters the brain's filters that limit perception of the physical world. Now that conspiracy is pretty well known, largely thanks to the research of Terence McKenna in the 90s, but it really got popular in the 2010s thanks to podcasts like Joe Rogan. But in this series, we take a look at the crazier, less known theories. And in this case, the theory we're going to look at is, what if DMT is not opening up your mind to allow you into another dimension, but instead allows us to see into a universal consciousness field? For example, if every human on Earth was mentally connected to a field of energy, and it's where we store our experiences, emotions, and knowledge, then would it be possible that DMT could basically mute a person's individual perspective for a short time, thus allowing the brain to tune into this universal shared consciousness, which would mean that it is neither a hallucination nor beings from an alternate dimension, but instead, you are seeing the fragments of memories, ideas, emotions, or knowledge from people all over the world, albeit the drug would only work temporarily, stopping you from really exploring this shared consciousness. And I know you may be thinking, this is total bunk and stupid to even suggest, but this actually piggybacks off a theory of the famous Carl Jung, the founder of the School of Analytical Psychology, who suggested a term called collective unconscious, which is basically a concept that the unconscious mind contains ideas that are shared by everyone in the world. The most basic one of these is instinct, things like survival, fear, the bond between a mother and child, fight or flight. All of these, according to Jung, are examples of a shared consciousness, but there's examples that are more complex than instinct, like the old wise man archetype, the kind and wise elderly father figure of the village or town, who shares knowledge with everyone and often offers advice to someone in need, a character like Merlin or Gandalf. This character does not belong to any one culture. Instead, all of them have a version of the wise old man archetype. Even pre-Columbian contact cultures, who had never met a European before, had their own version of the wise old man. So Jung reasoned, how could every culture group on Earth, who in many cases had no contact with other cultures, still have the same types of stories and characters? Because it wasn't just the wise old man story. Another archetype is the tree of life. This again is shared by numerous religions and cultures all over the world. A tree of knowledge, or tree of knowledge of good and evil, or tree of life, etc. Because of all this, Jung believed there was an unconscious layer of the human psyche that transcended cultural differences. So with that, let's go back to the DMT elves being connected to this shared consciousness. If Jung is right with his theory, then it is perhaps possible that DMT allows you to basically see someone else's thoughts, enter their mind, perhaps even view reality through their eyes. And if that is true, then it means human consciousness might be just one node in this huge network of awareness that connects us all. And it's certain psychedelics that can crack through this wall only for a short time and let us view inside. The theory further elaborates that if certain groups, aka the shadow organizations or government, knew how to manipulate this field of consciousness, then it would be super easy to influence thought. It could even explain things like mass hysteria, or perhaps the suppression of ideas that would benefit mankind, which might explain why psychedelics are illegal in most places. When it comes to secret bases inside the United States, there are none bigger than Area 51. It's a highly classified detachment ran by the Edwards Air Force Base in Nevada, and has been around since the 1950s. And while it's largely thought that the base is basically nothing more than a testing ground for new weapons and aircraft, it hasn't stopped conspiracy theorists who over the years have made guesses on what's really going on there. But what if I was to tell you that, despite Area 51's reputation, there is possibly another base that outdoes it in every way? That brings us to Dulce Base in Dulce, New Mexico, along the Colorado border. If you have never heard of this base, don't feel bad, because most haven't, and that's because it probably doesn't exist, which is the conspiracy itself. The whole compound is said to exist completely underground and is a jointly operated facility ran by humans and aliens. See, this all began in 1979, when a Paul Benowitz, a businessman from Albuquerque, began claiming he was intercepting electronic communications between an underground base somewhere he had not identified yet and UFOs. But he would eventually locate the site of this base, somewhere in Dulce, and since Paul was already a big name in the UFO world, having been an investigator during the 70s, this was considered big news in the UFO world. Because according to Paul, it all started that July when he started filming strange lights and picked up the unusual radio signals over Kirtland Air Base in Albuquerque. Now there's a lot to this story, and I won't dive into all the particulars, but basically, the story kind of spun out of control and eventually brought in abduction accounts, UFO sightings, and cattle mutilations. But I want to concentrate on the structure itself. Dulce was said to be broken up into 7 different levels underground, the first being the security area, second level being human housing, third being the control and surveillance floor. The fourth layer is where the restrictions start, where the humans who have top secret clearance can go, and requires alien approval. The fifth level is where alien housing and communications were carried out, and I should probably remind you here that the aliens were often seen working together with the human researchers, although this relationship was described as uneasy. Dropping down to layer 6, you get the infamous Nightmare Hall. Here it was said that genetic experiments described as grotesque were carried out. In particular, alleged witnesses who had gotten access, or were former employees, claimed that in these areas you could find disembodied human limbs, as well as creatures that looked like they belonged in a horror novel. These were often kept suspended in a gel-like fluid, and of course, human-alien hybrids. But how did they get these hybrids? That's the dark and interesting part. The humans were often test subjects who had their genetic material cloned or spliced to then cross over with aliens. But are the test subjects there voluntarily? That would be a no. These are people that have been abducted and can consist of military personnel and civilians, where they are imprisoned, waiting their turn for experimentation. Now, not all of these humans are used for cloning or the mixing of species. Some of them are used to test certain viruses and pathogens on them, basically bioweapons research. And suffice to say, many of the humans employed here allegedly had no idea this stuff was going on. But the final level is 7, where the most sensitive materials are kept. It's here you will find large cryogenic freezers for all the genetic material stored. Some sources say there's even a giant incinerator here to destroy the failed experiments. Now I would tend to think that even in the conspiracy world, most of us would agree that all this is totally ridiculous and not believable at all. And there might be a reason for that, and that's the real conspiracy here. Because a man named Richard Doty, a confirmed former special agent within the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, later claimed that he intentionally gave Paul Benowitz a lot of this false information, as it was part of his job duties. See, when Benowitz had made contact with Richard, that really made him feel like he had a special link behind the veil of secrecy inside the government, who could tell him about UFOs, and this naturally excited him. So Richard went along with Paul's ridiculous claims of the underground bunker and the so-called Nightmare Hall, and not only that, he made up fictional documents that he then pretended to sneak out and give to him as evidence, which only further reinforced his beliefs that he was onto something. But Richard wasn't done. He even took it a step further and encouraged Paul to expand his theories to the point they reached levels of complete absurdities that would bring us the underground base known as Dulce, and after a while, even the UFO community began to doubt Paul's claims, which might have been the goal all along. Another UFO researcher, Bill Moore, would later even confess to the UFO community that he had been working with Richard to manipulate Bennewitz to try and destroy his reputation, although he claimed he had only been doing this because he had been coerced to do so. And before long, other UFO researchers cut all ties with Bennewitz, and he soon became isolated, and his mental health took a serious toll, and he ended up in a mental facility for a while. And some have argued that was the government's objective all along. But why target Paul? That's the real question. Most believe now that, although his claims, which were encouraged by the government, were absolutely false, they could have been hiding something else. Could it have been highly classified programs at the nearby Kirtland Air Force Base, where Paul had been monitoring radio signals and was causing issues for them? Maybe he was inadvertently exposing secret military operations, or maybe they were just using Paul as a stooge to take attention away from these very real projects, or as some suggest, it was actually nothing more than a chance to study how a disinformation campaign could work perfectly. Although there is a lot that Americans in recent years are divided on, one thing that has always garnered support of the majority of Americans is our national parks. Depending on the poll, 75 to 80% of Americans on both sides of the political aisle love the park system, while around 66% believe the park should be a top priority and should receive more funding. And it's easy to see why that is. These parks often encapsulate some of the most beautiful parts of the country. And even if you're not a camper, hiker, or outdoorsman, there's not many who don't appreciate the beauty and serenity of nature. But if you are someone that frequents the parks, you will have no doubt went one day planning to go on a hike only to find out a certain part of the trail had been closed, or that certain parts of the park are completely shut down for maintenance. Heck, sometimes the entire park itself might be closed due to maintenance, or because they don't have the money and the required staff to do such maintenance. But what if there is a darker reason why these areas of the park are shut down so often? And no, I'm not talking about David Pilatus here. The first national park in the world came about in 1872, when the Yellowstone National Park Act was signed, and a little over 40 years later, the National Park Service, a bureau of the federal government, came into existence, with the stated goal to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife there within, and to provide there for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Of course, according to this conspiracy, that is only the cover for what the National Park Service is really up to. First, look at the terrain of these places. It's often in these remote areas where the land is rugged and heavily forested. Sometimes it's nothing but mountains. Now let's take a look at some American cryptids like Bigfoot, Mothman, Skinwalkers, Wendigo, etc. Have you ever noticed, in almost every story concerning them, they are usually seen in those same types of terrain? Heck, a good portion of the reported sightings occur in national parks. Let's take the Patterson-Gimlin film for example, maybe the most famous cryptid footage in the world. Where was it taken? Six Rivers National Forest in California. The Pacific Northwest in general has become known as a beacon for Bigfoot sightings, along with Mount Rainier and Olympic National Park, which have their own unexplained phenomena. It kinda makes sense too. These regions will provide the best cover for these animals as well. With all the natural barriers, the parks would almost act like fences that the cryptids knew not to leave, thus limiting their exposure to humans. But circling back to the main part of this conspiracy, what's the deal with them having closed off areas so often? Of course, they typically say it's to do maintenance, or wildlife management, or sometimes due to wildfires. But what if these closures are just a cover for the National Park Service, or some other organization, to go in and deal with different types of supernatural phenomena? For example, a wildfire might actually be a controlled burn to eradicate cryptid nests. Or is it possible that an area shut down for bear activity is actually code for an increase in sightings for these creatures that are not yet publicly acknowledged? Is this nothing more than a way for the government to deal with these entities without alerting the public? Or let's say there's an uptick in Bigfoot sightings in one park. That park could then be closed for a wildlife management day. as a way for the authorities to track down and relocate the cryptids in secret, or perhaps deal with them in more lethal ways. Then afterwards, they go about removing tracks, nests, and remains, and/or send them to secret labs to be studied. There could even be preventive maintenance windows when the park is always shut down at certain times of the year because they know when a particular cryptid is on the move or going to be spotted more often, or perhaps maybe at times of the year when unexplained phenomena spikes, like UFO sightings. While we're on the subject, have you ever noticed that although the parks are absolutely huge, very little is done when making it accessible? Instead, there are usually a few campsites, hiking trails, and recreational facilities. The rest of the park could only be reached by going off trail through very difficult terrain just to see it. The skeptic will claim that's because they are trying to keep the park's nature as pristine as possible, but believers in this conspiracy suggest this is done to show that the parks are technically open to the public, but they know the vast majority of people are not going to be physically fit enough to actually make it into these areas where these things may be. And I know I said this was not a Dave Pilatus conspiracy, but the 411 mystery does connect, because some people believe that the strange disappearances in these national parks are because of all these said cryptids, who would often leave no trace of a person. But maybe they're doing it for territorial reasons, or food, or simple curiosity. The point is, they're behind it. Others believe that the national parks act as hotspots for interdimensional portals, where people may be stepping into them accidentally and vanishing completely. And again, the government knows all this and is actively covering it up, so tourism to these parks will continue to thrive. When it comes to the origin of life on Earth, many theories have been proposed, but maybe none as famous as panspermia, which states that life originated elsewhere in the universe and arrived to Earth via space dust, meteoroid, asteroids, and comets. This life would have been things like microbes that could survive in space, like bacteria, and once the space debris crashed into Earth and shattered into pieces, spores would be spread, and in 1,000,000 years or so, life would begin to take on more complex forms. And that's all pretty well known, but to scientists, it's nothing more than a fringe theory. But to this next conspiracy theory, panspermia is not only the real way life on Earth began, but it was intentional. According to the ones that believe this theory, panspermia was not accidental, as some claim, and instead, it was an intentional act by a very advanced species who were trying to seed random planets. So they began scanning the cosmos for planets that could potentially sustain life and began bombarding them with microorganisms to see which would be capable of evolving into intelligent beings. And that's where the second part of this conspiracy comes in, the sentience sonar. See, once these microbes travel across distant galaxies, crash land on a planet, and then wake up and begin evolving, over time, some kind of intelligent life would emerge and become the dominant species on the planet, not unlike Earth. Then this species, if it kept advancing as it should, would become a spacefaring species. And once that point emerges, then they, or in this case, us, would begin unintentionally sending signals into space, which would eventually make it back to the alien species who seeded the planet in the first place, and thereby alerting them of a habitable planet. This, of course, would take millions of years to all play out, but doing this to tens of thousands or even millions of planets would result in multiple hits, and would sort of be like sonar, hence the theory name. Of course, the question then becomes, why would they even bother doing this? And that's where the theory splits off into a few different directions. Some speculate their civilization is dying, and they are hoping to spread life beyond their planet before it's too late. Or perhaps it is part of their ideological belief to seed the galaxy with life. Or maybe it's an attempt to create a universe of minds that could conceivably act as one in an attempt to achieve a higher cosmic goal. Or the whole thing may serve as some kind of research, and the inhabitants of these planets never know they are part of a larger study, regardless of which, once they began receiving signals from these different planets, whether that be radio waves or whatever, it would be like the cosmic version of an echo that an advanced civilization has developed, and it would confirm their efforts from over 1,000,000 years ago has succeeded. Alex Jones has been called many things: grifter, patriot, comedian, crazy man, but say what you want about him, he is able to get attention. And according to this next theory, that might have been the goal all along. Could it be that Jones' highly theatrical and hyperbolic ramblings, where he screams and makes some incredibly stupid claims, are nothing more than an agenda by the deep state to undermine the credibility of the very legitimate conspiracies, especially the ones that concern corruptions or the abuse of government powers? See, that's the theory here. Alex Jones, the conspiracy nut, is actually a performance artist that has long worked for the deep state, and that claim, that he is a performance artist, actually comes from a good source, Jones's own lawyer, who stated at his divorce hearing that Jones was simply putting on a show and basically mocking conspiracy theorists in the process by putting out dumber and dumber theories to see who all will fall for it, while at the same time completely tarnishing legit conspiracies and discouraging people from talking about them. This, of course, would be disputed by Jones on his own program later on, although at court he did say in general he agreed with his own lawyer, and Jones's supporters ever since have tried to claim he only said this so he would have split custody with his kids and so he wouldn't lose money. Although the counter-argument to that is, if he's willing to compromise on his so-called truthful statements that he's made in the past because he doesn't want to lose his money, then that means he's basically for sale and will say whatever someone tells him to say if the price is right. Which brings us back to the theory that he plays his part so perfectly that he has made anyone who believes conspiracies seem like unhinged people, and any of the genuine claims that Jones had brought up, like corruption or surveillance on its own people, gets drowned out by all of his stupid claims, which misleads his audience from those core things that he should really be concerned about. This also comes into play when you look at his social media bans. It's just possible the deep state ordered YouTube and the other platforms to ban him, and then using their own powers behind the scenes, kept Jones at his high-profile status, because instead of fading away once he was banned, he stayed relevant, and some might argue he got more popular, because his supporters believed, see, they wouldn't ban him if he wasn't exposing the real truth, while in reality, that was what the deep state planned all along. In fact, Bill Cooper, who many consider the first and true conspiracy theorist on radio, although he was doing his show on shortwave, claimed that after going on Alex Jones's show, he realized he was nothing more than a BS artist, showman, and coward. And when he figured out who Jones really was, he had nothing more to do with him, ignoring his calls and requests to come back onto the show. But we can take it a step further. All of Jones's legal battles, especially those involving Sandy Hook, has damaged not only Jones, but anyone who aligns themselves with the anti-establishment community, which some point out was the plan all along implemented by the deep state, and then carried out perfectly by Jones, which means he is a great actor, maybe even trained by some of the finest teachers in the country. Is it possible he didn't attend a community college? Instead, he went to the Juilliard School of Acting, where he then made his deep state connection. All of this, of course, plays into the bigger picture. If Jones is controlled opposition, then any of these movements considered anti-establishment could also just be ran by the deep state, which of course means that any of these groups will have a harder time finding followers, since it is impossible to say which ones are compromised. Of course, maybe Alex Jones is just a grifter. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a very strange epidemic would pop up that still hasn't been fully explained to this day. Of course, I am talking about the Dancing Plague, which took place over a 3-month period between July and September. It started with a woman named Frau Trophia, who began dancing uncontrollably in the streets before dozens of other people joined her and then danced on for days, which then spiraled into a mass hysteria and caused more and more people to dance. And although this might sound harmless, it ended up causing some of the dancers to die from exhaustion or a heart attack or stroke. For centuries, historians have tried to assign different causes to what started it, like the eating of bread, which had the ergot fungus on it, or even due to some religious reasons. But what if there was a more evil reason? That brings us to the theory that the Dancing Plague was started by a memetic virus. And what is that, you might ask? You are no doubt already familiar with the term meme, which was coined by Richard Dawkins, and basically, it's just a unit of cultural information, like an idea, behavior, or style. that is then spread throughout a culture, like an internet joke. We all know that's a meme, but so is fashion trends, urban legends, and even religious beliefs. So a memetic virus is the belief that these ideas and patterns are so contagious that they act like viruses that attack the mind instead of the body. So instead of having body aches from the flu, you instead get a song stuck in your head for days, and no matter what you do, it won't leave. This could be seen as a memetic infection. Or it's even possible you got wrapped up in the latest internet fad, like the Ice Bucket Challenge, which is so catchy that it infected the minds of millions of people simultaneously. Well, just like those examples, the dancing plague is the same. Frau Trophia was patient zero, and when she started dancing, the idea caught on, and soon, others could not resist but to dance with her, working sorta like a traditional virus that spreads through physical contact or droplets. Memetic viruses could even spread through simple interactions like watching someone perform the action, or even hearing a specific phrase. And this theory speculates that the dancing plague was one of the first, if not first, memetic viruses ever documented. Now of course, like real viruses, it could have been a totally random event spawning up like real viruses do. But in our theory, it suggested that this was some kind of deliberate psychological attack by, you guessed it, one of those secret society groups of power. Which of course means, if this group was able to pull this off successfully centuries ago, is it still being done, and how? Well, of course, if the knowledge to pull this off has been recorded, you can almost bet someone behind the scenes is still releasing these viruses upon us. And how would they do it? Could it be different depending on each case? Could they engineer viruses for specific personalities? Or may even take time studying certain individuals' mental and emotional weaknesses and then creating viruses that would affect only people with certain traits. They could even attack people with high anxiety or that suffer from paranoia, and the virus would eventually cause them to spiral into madness. Or maybe you will find those who have a high level of empathy, making them more susceptible to a mass emotional virus. The scary part about this is, these weapons would be totally silent. There would be no way to trace down who fired it and when, and people who were exposed would not even know they were infected. Going back to the Ice Bucket Challenge, and what one might think is a harmless trend, could be the catalyst for spreading a mental virus. And before long, so many people are infected that you don't even notice the gradual change in behavior. Secret organizations could use this in so many destructive ways, like destabilizing whole societies or governments. They could cause mass hysteria, fear, and confusion, which of course would cause more panic and chaos. You could even create a virus to target specific political beliefs, to sway elections, and cause unrest. You could even say that misinformation campaigns that are used today are a form of memetic warfare, slowly infecting huge portions of the population. And of course, none of this could be easily stopped or cured, and the person could seemingly be manipulated in such a way to serve the interest of a powerful secret group for basically the rest of their lives. Unless, of course, someone, or a group of people, became aware of the viruses and created countermeasures, like some kind of memetic cure for the virus. And it's just as likely these secret societies are testing out several different types of viruses on different types of people, which they monitor over time and refine the formula before they release them on a large scale. When it comes to video games and conspiracies, there's not a lot that immediately pop to mind. But there are a couple of more famous ones that you have probably heard of. Maybe the biggest is that online video games are constantly monitored by various intelligence agencies around the world. And why would they do this? Well, for one, players often speak candidly during the in-game chats, and it gives an inside look to real unfiltered views at certain sensitive topics. Maybe topics that the governments feel are dangerous, which requires constant monitoring with the populace to make sure everyone stays in line. And considering that many video game lobbies connect players from all over the world, they would soon be able to notice patterns not just from one country, but all over the world. Sensitive topics would no longer be a regional issue, but a global issue, one that they could study. You could even take it a step further and suggest that these agencies are watching how these players work together as a team, how they respond under stress, how they compete, which would also add more data to this eavesdropping. Which brings us to the next point, the legality of it. I was able to find that in the US at least, law enforcement cannot snoop on you directly without a warrant. However, in a public lobby, they are free to record as much as they want, which in many cases is quite a lot. So basically, the first part of the conspiracy suggests that the powers that be could now, in real time, monitor shifts in society before they happen, and adjust accordingly, just by putting all this data together and analyzing trends. But this isn't the only big video game conspiracy. Another one that has been around for decades is the government uses violent video games to desensitize young players. That way, when they get older, they will join the military and become unquestioning killing machines who will make them much easier to control and keep them from asking questions on why they are involved in these wars that they themselves might find unjust. But it's this conspiracy that has been flipped around that we are going to discuss. Because in this one, the theory suggests that it's not the government pushing for all these video games to be more violent. Instead, it is the developers themselves doing it, but not for the obvious reason, not to make more money. Instead, it's alleged that these video games are made this way consciously or subconsciously to actually reduce fear in the populace, sorta as a way to counteract the government's attempts at scaring that same populace. By putting players in a game with tons of simulated violence, these players become more accustomed to the chaos and violent scenarios, and because of that, they lose their susceptibility to the government's attempts at scaring anyone with a terroristic threat. Because going back to another classic conspiracy, many governments use terrorism, or external threats, as an excuse to increase surveillance on its own citizens, or to make laws more restrictive. These games serve as a counterbalance to that, allowing people to emotionally disengage from it, because they've already seen these same scenarios play out dozens of times in a virtual environment. And since they have been in the same scenario so many times, they are far less likely to comply when governments overreach via using the same scenarios. Of course, the bigger question is, are the video game developers themselves really behind this move? Most likely not, since at the end of the day, they are just trying to make money. But it is possible that a secretive shadow group is. If we go back to the last video in this series, we discussed a conspiracy which suggested that numerous shadow groups behind the scenes are constantly at war with each other, trying to gain total power of the government and people. One of these groups may be on the good side, and are trying to help stop it, much like the Illuminati are the good guys theory we also looked at in the last video. Or it could be that just one of these groups is trying to throw a wrench into the plans of another, and they came up with a great way to desensitize people to terroristic threats. When it comes to the Titanic, there are numerous conspiracies involved. One of the biggest is that the Titanic never actually sunk, but instead was swapped out with its near-identical sister ship, the RMS Olympic, which then sunk in its place. But why in the world would this happen? According to the theory, the owners of the White Star Line ships, specifically a J. Bruce Ismay, orchestrated the whole plot as part of insurance fraud, because the Olympic had actually been in a collision with another ship just a year prior, and although it had substantial damage, it was repairable. But since these repairs were going to cost a ton of money, the company kept all that a secret and instead secretly altered it to look like the Titanic, and then it was purposely sent out knowing it would sink, and the company would inherit the insurance money. But what if there's a different reason, one that lies outside of Earth? Of course, I'm referring to aliens, who according to the theory, deliberately caused the sinking of the Titanic for one particular reason, to stop, or at the very least, slow down and prevent the building of superstructures, all for the reason that aliens have a vested interest in keeping humanity on a relatively small scale of technological advancement, because it is feared if we could progress at building superstructures, then at some point humanity could build a Dyson sphere, which is a hypothetical megastructure that encompasses a star and captures its power output, which of course could then be used for energy for space traveling, which of course means man could potentially begin expanding across the galaxy, and also means that the aliens would not be happy about it, and might be actively sabotaging these huge projects that are undertaken by us. Although, an alternate take on the theory is that aliens are our benevolent watchers who are trying to keep us on the planet until it's safe to leave. But back to the Titanic, it's not the only example. as history, according to the theory, has shown numerous times. Like the Hindenburg, it was the largest airship ever built at the time, and it actually led to a lot of talk about the future of long-distance travel, how it was going to change it all, and boom, the crash basically killed any future for airship travel, although it did not delay airplanes for very long. There's also Chernobyl, which again, according to the theory, was orchestrated by these alien beings to halt the advance of progressing too far with nuclear energy. Or what about the explosion of the Challenger space shuttle? Around that time, the idea of having more commercial and military trips into space was gaining momentum, and then this highly publicized mission would fail in front of the world, and basically did away with those ideas for the next couple of decades. Some even take the conspiracy all the way back to 48 BC, with the burning of the Library of Alexandria. What if it was not an accident, and instead caused by these same alien beings who wanted to set back the advance of humanity? It could explain why the expansion of the Roman Empire was met with very little technological advances, but how exactly are these alien beings pulling this off? That's another good question. For example, if we go back to the Titanic, it's possible that they were able to somehow get inside the ship, maybe even using a cloaking device, which allowed them to move around unseen, and then tamper with the engine, or mess with the navigational system. Or heck, they could have even mastered weather control, which allowed them to move or alter the iceberg, making it more dangerous. There could have been multiple ways for them to pull stuff like this off. The Smithsonian Museum is actually a group of museums, 21 to be exact, along with 21 libraries, 14 education and research centers, a zoo, historical and architectural landmarks, along with 200 more institutions that are considered affiliates, and it was all created by the US government. Yet, it is not part of any of the 3 branches of government, but it is funded by them, along with much of the funding coming from private and corporate donations, as well as money they make off concessions and retail and the likes, since visiting is actually free, which goes along with its official stated goal to spread knowledge to America's citizens. Having said all that, some conspiracy theorists just don't buy it, and that's not really a surprise, is it? Because the Smithsonian, basically since its inception, has long been accused of hiding or destroying any kind of evidence that would discredit evolution, and to maintain the current narrative of human history. But why exactly is this a concern? Well, that goes back to what it is exactly that the Smithsonian is hiding. According to the theory, there have been numerous large human skeletons that would suggest giants once roamed the earth, as well as some artifacts that suggest ancient civilizations were way more advanced than we give them credit for. See, it's these findings that would challenge the mainstream view that giants, divine beings, and/or very advanced cultures never existed. But why wouldn't a researcher who could possibly make one of the most important findings in history not want to document it? I mean, the legit discovery of a giant alone would basically make you rich, and your name would forever live on in history and archaeology. Well, of course, the reasons pitched is that the governments, or the secret powers that be, are threatening these archaeologists, or perhaps they are hiding and covering up any evidence themselves. But the reasoning is, if the public were able to find out that humanity is not the most advanced being on Earth, it could totally undermine governments, institutions, and authorities. Because, well, the confidence in them would no longer be the same. Because people would begin questioning the competence and legitimacy of the current system, especially if we found out there were superior civilizations and beings that came before us. It would also challenge many religions who all put humanity at the center of creation. It would force theologians to completely reevaluate religious texts and doctrines. And then, of course, history itself would have to be rewritten. That includes school books, historical accounts, as well as universities who would have to totally change their perspectives on civilizations and, yes, giants. So the only way out of this is to suppress the evidence. And institutions like the Smithsonian would be out in the very front, taking the lead, burying whatever goes against the narrative. Don't forget, we are the most important and advanced species on Earth. Nothing could come before us. And who can blame them for saying this? Because it's keeping the whole of our society together. This next one, I have to be a bit careful about, as I don't want the video to draw the ire of the YouTube gods. But you have probably heard the Comic-Con recruitment conspiracy, which basically alleges that numerous children disappear every year at Comic-Con, and they know this, but are being paid to keep quiet about it. Or the Comic-Con organizers are even complicit in their disappearances. In either case, it's because it's such a large event with tens of thousands of people visiting a year that it's supposed to be an ideal venue for potential predators, or for people to even recruit them into cults, or any number of illegal activities, especially considering parents may be distracted by entertainment. And of course, like a lot of these theories, it's said some dark secret group is running this whole thing. The theory got really popular within the last decade, but like most conspiracies, there's no proof for it. But there may be a reason for that, and that is, the Comic-Con recruiting conspiracy was actually completely made up by this secret shadow group. Hence, it's a conspiracy about a conspiracy. Yes, according to this one, this whole unsettling theory was meant to scare parents into not going to Comic-Con. But not just that, the theory is even bigger. Think about the news. You have probably heard, if it bleeds, it leads, as it's very common the top news stories usually revolve around a grisly murder or gang violence or kidnappings. And you may think, well, that's our society. But what if it's not? What if some of this is manufactured and blasted onto our TVs and cell phones with the latest news of violence near you? What if all this constant crime-related stories, especially the ones involving children, are just a reminder to all of us that the world is a very dangerous place? The theory further states that not only does this help fuel the TV ratings, but a lot of these stories are selectively reported to push an agenda of fear, which of course means this secret shadow group is also controlling all the news stations. But why would they do this? Well, see, by amplifying fear of the outside world, people are more likely to just stay inside their homes, where they then become dependent on the internet for socialization and entertainment. Of course, this makes them even easier targets for online manipulation, which includes propaganda, advertising, and radicalization, which we discussed in the previous video. This only gets worse on social media, where these secret organizations know exactly what makes you the most afraid, so your phone is bombarded by some of the worst stories, which makes you realize you made the right decision to stay inside your home again. Now it gets even better, because with everyone afraid to leave their homes, we become dependent on e-commerce, with a huge bump in revenue for companies that make home security systems, or doorbell cameras, etc. Heck, a lot of people may have those smart home devices that promise safety, but really just allow these companies to monitor your movements and actions. This creates an atmosphere where people are subtly manipulated into compliance, preferring safety to freedom. Is there a dark underworld of medical care? Of course, some of you may say that even normal medical care is dark, but I'm talking about an actual underground, outside the legal limits medical care. This is what our next conspiracy alleges, called dark medicine, which basically states there is a whole underground black market of medical care mainly set up for wanted criminals. I actually first heard of this conspiracy a long time ago in an episode of Batman the Animated Series called Paging the Crime Doctor, and just like it says, criminals of the underworld could not visit a standard doctor, so they instead went to one who had his license revoked, or one that is somehow being blackmailed by a criminal organization. But in our reality, the theory basically states that highly wanted criminals who may be sick and very desperate go to these hidden clinics staffed by doctors and nurses who have all had their license revoked for one reason or another. Although sometimes the conspiracy revolves around the underground trade of drugs, medical supplies, and counterfeit medicine. But the conspiracy takes a darker side when we turn to plastic surgery, because it's also suggested that some of these underground doctors are performing cosmetic surgery on some unwilling people, like anyone who has been kidnapped. Yes, this might include face reshaping, but also alterations to fingerprints and things like that. It might also include people who are trying to escape a gang or a cult, or sometimes trying to escape traffickers themselves. The theory also elaborates that sometimes law enforcement knows this and turns a blind eye, or that some powerful group of elites are wanting to do away with these people. Let's say one day you are driving on your way home from work and you stop to pick up some food, and as you start slowly driving through the parking lot, you see a homeless man. He looks very down on his luck, and as your headlights pass over him and you catch a glimpse of his face, you realize he looks familiar. but it doesn't hit you right away until you drive off and it hits you later on. That looked a lot like actor Glenn Powell from the movie Top Gun Maverick. So you turn your car around and speed back to get a second look, and he's gone. Or let's say that it's a Friday night after a long work week, and you stop at the store to pick up your drink of choice, and as you walk out, a vagrant comes up to you and asks for some spare change. As you reach in your pocket to give him a few bucks, you notice that his clothes, although dirty and ragged, seem kinda new. And actually, you even notice that the man has no smell of alcohol or bad body odor. In fact, he looks sorta well kempt and handsome. Actually, he looks vaguely like actor Channing Tatum in some kinda weird homeless man disguise. If this has ever happened to you, then you experienced the conspiracy known as celebrity slumming. It basically theorizes that over the years, several celebrities, not just actors, anyone from musicians to billionaires, like to play this game where they, for lack of a better term, slum it up. The reasons why they do this tends to vary, but the main one of course is supposed to be a form of thrill seeking. Like these people begin to feel a boredom with their lives of being super wealthy and think going undercover as someone that has nothing and going around in a city for a few hours, or days, or even weeks will give them a rush of adrenaline they can find no other way. And they also know that they can abandon it at any time and go back to their lives of comfort and wealth. Now sometimes it's said, the celebrities get together and discuss their adventures of slumming, while sometimes they just up and do it alone to see for themselves. Basically, think of it as poverty tourism. Another line of thought is, they just do it to escape the limelight for a little while. The downside of being a celebrity is the paparazzi's always following you and people looking for autographs, wanting to say hi, etc. So the disguise of a homeless person could throw everyone off, and you could practically be invisible. Then, we go to another suggestion, which brings out the more charitable celebrities. Maybe those who campaign for donations to charities that help with poverty. These celebrities could be taking on the role just to get a first-hand look at the struggles, while others may do it to get a better understanding, possibly for a role as an actor. And as far as actual occurrences of this, there's some online conjecture that Justin Bieber and Miley Cyrus have been spotted at events like rainbow gatherings or Burning Man, yet they were both wearing disguises. Well, there's also claims that Zach Galifianakis has been spotted impersonating a homeless guy. And we also have Jared Leto, who's a method actor, who spent time with heroin junkies preparing for a role, and he later on stated he was basically homeless at that time. When it comes to conspiracies, one of the most famous and long-running ones is the depopulation theory, which of course suggests that the elite plans to depopulate the planet, getting rid of the vast majority of people that they consider are just a waste of resources. And this conspiracy, as scary as it is, has some basis in reality. It's known as the useless eaters theory, and the Nazis actually carried it out when they were in power, murdering around 250,000 people who had some kind of disability, whether it be with their mind, or blindness, or deafness, or even a mental illness. But it's that evil program that our conspiracy is rooted in, and is actually expanded. Not only are the targets people with disabilities, but now it's anyone who could be considered a burden on the planet's resources. The poor, unskilled laborers, people with chronic health issues, the elderly, all of these are now targets. And according to the theory, they are sought out by the elite, billionaires, along with companies and shadowy organizations that are funneling money into this secret program to slowly kill all these people. And how are they doing it? Well, according to the variation of this theory, they do it by releasing diseases into the population, or pandemics that may target a certain group, like seniors, or by promoting government policies that make it difficult to get healthcare, or by reducing the birth rates, either by promoting safe sex or any kind of vaccination, which they will claim is actually sterilizing people. And as mentioned, the reason they are said to do all this is because the planet's resources can no longer support the number of people, and plus, it's just easier to control a smaller population. And let's just say that this theory is true, but the methods are completely fictional. They're not releasing diseases or sterilizing people. Instead, their method is much more sneaky and devious. This gives us the theory known as Fast Food Entrapment Endgame, which suggests the fast food industry is working along with the elite to slowly depopulate the planet. Of course, everyone already knows that fast food is bad for you, and some say addicting, but this theory takes it a step further and suggests that as technology gets better and the restaurants refine their processes, they get closer and closer to creating a food that is not only addicting, but has zero nutrients in it, which of course means that a population that is hooked on this food continues to eat more and more while at the same time becoming malnourished, and ultimately in bad health and death, leading to population decline. And the theory can even be expanded to include processed foods from the store, not just restaurant, where every year the nutritional value in the groceries you buy drops a little more, leaving you with the bare minimum nutrition to survive, unless of course you buy organic foods, which are getting more and more expensive every year, and really shows the affordability gap between unhealthy options and organic options. Which brings us back to the larger point. Who is it that typically buys fast food and processed food more on the whole? That's right, those living below the poverty line. Because even in the poorest parts of the country, you can find a McDonald's, or a store full of processed unhealthy food. That's one of the big points in this theory, that this food is typically aimed right at the ones that are not so privileged, the ones who may be a burden on society for these elite people, those who may even know that the food they are eating is bad, but they can't afford healthier options. And you see this now with the chronic health issues and obesity in the country, which leaves a small amount of healthy food for the middle class, while the people at the top take the best food only. Fortune magazine, which has been around since 1929, is famous for one particular release they have every year. That is, the Fortune 500, which details the top 500 profitable companies in America, something that it has been doing since 1959. And it's no shock that our next conspiracy starts here, because so many of these big corporations have their own conspiracies, some of them rather dark. But this next one takes on a different twist you might not expect, and that is, these so-called richest companies in the country don't turn a profit. Instead, these companies are engaging in practices that create the illusion that they are making a profit. Also, they can maintain control over the market and keep their own company from collapsing. Since they can usually predict the amount of revenue they will earn for a year, they can make the financials appear better than what they really are. They can also make it look like their debts are minimal, and really just make it seem like their company is killing it. Even if it appears the company is poor, they can repurchase their own stocks to artificially inflate share prices, knowing good and well that the company is not worth it. They just know they need to convince the investors it is, so they pull off pump and dump schemes or do some inside trading. And we know it's possible because some companies even plan what they call strategic losses, like engaging in price wars with a company that you want to put out of business. What better way than for a bigger company to sell their products for a loss, knowing the other company cannot afford to and will go under? We've seen that with Walmart. Some companies, again Walmart, even keep losing money by keeping some items priced very low, just so no other competitors can ever catch up. Or think about Netflix, Disney, and Amazon. Look at their streaming deals. You could get Netflix and Disney for under $30 a month. And if you have Amazon Prime, you already get their streaming. So considering these companies are making their own productions now, which cost millions and up to $1 billion, are they even turning a profit on these streaming services? Or is it just to make sure no competitors get their product on the market? Some companies may just be borrowing more and more money to keep things afloat, hoping to pay the debt off in the future, or possibly even buying up smaller companies or touting a product they consider innovating when in reality they know it will never work, all for the sole reason of looking like a company that is doing well. So much so, you don't even realize they have no real growth. Heck, they could even use the borrowed money to pay PR firms to come up with stories that would downplay any struggles with the company, while making their successes seem out of this world. But why do all this? That goes back to maintaining control over the market. Sure, the company might be doing bad now, but as long as no competitors can pop up, they'll be okay. And maybe someday, they'll even turn a profit again. Of course, these powerful group of elites working with the people from the government and financial institutes are all supposed to be working together to keep these companies on the top, which in turn allows the business world to dictate the legislation they want from politicians and basically guaranteeing they will get a bailout if they ever need one. And I know you might be saying, well, this data is public knowledge, and if they were cooking the books, they would get caught. But this was actually addressed already. Have you ever seen the 2015 film, The Big Short, featuring Christian Bale? Well, it was based on the book of the same name, and it's that book that makes the argument that these companies are so huge and complex that no one on the outside could ever accurately audit them, which leaves us with one option. We just have to believe whatever these companies tell us. And as you can probably imagine, that leaves the door wide open for a lot of fraud. But I'll leave it to you. Are these companies feeding us an illusion of success? This is our second Tor conspiracy since we started this series, with the first one coming back on part 2. In that segment, we discussed how Tor is really being used to capture people who insist on being anonymous, because they might be a problem for the government. And as we discussed there, Tor was actually created by the government, or maybe it's better to say, the Navy. Anyways, this next conspiracy takes a little different twist on that theory and suggests that Tor is not a honeypot, and instead, it's an old outdated tool abandoned by the government. The theory basically revolves around the idea that outdated military technology is often released to the public. There's a lot of things that originally began as concepts in the military, and once it outgrew its usefulness and become old, the public was given access to it. For example, GPS. It has been around since the 70s, but wasn't released to the public until 1993. The EpiPen was designed as an antidote for nerve gas attacks in the mid-70s, before it was approved for the general public in the 80s. And of course, the Jeep, which was first introduced as a military vehicle in World War II before being released to the public a few years later. Which brings us back to our topic at hand, Tor, which was developed in the mid-90s and declassified and given to the public in 2002. Is it possible, since it was just handed over to the public to use, that they have long since abandoned Tor for something much more efficient? That brings us to Mariana's Web, which is supposed to be this more secure, deeper layer of the internet that only government people can use, especially spies, and of course, other powerful organizations. It's been floating around in the conspiracy circles for a few years now, and it's supposed to be completely hidden from the general public, hence why you have never seen any screenshots of it. And it's here that the users are able to engage in the most secretive of communications, or activities. Some forum users often claim it's based on quantum encryptions, and its current security makes Tor seem like a joke, hence the reason it was abandoned. Let's say it's late one night and you got the munchies. So you get up and go out to a local store or 24/7 restaurant and pick up some nachos and head home. Everything is going good until you pass your local Walmart and notice something strange in the back parking lot. It looks like men in military fatigues moving about. So you begin to wonder, what's up? And you decide to go get a closer peek. And as you make your way into the parking lot and drive around the back of the building, you see nothing. They all disappeared. And you are simply left to wonder, are you losing your mind? But what if there is another option? That brings us to the Walmart underground bases conspiracy, which sounds exactly like you think. Walmart, because of its large buildings and because of its strategic locations, it's built for another purpose, to hide underground tunnels used by the military or government. This can be staging areas or just complete secret facilities themselves, or possibly even just built for the elite in case of emergency situations, like a disaster. Likewise, if there was ever an invasion, the soldiers could just deploy equipment from Walmart and basically have every town in America defended. Some even take the conspiracy a little further and suggest that Walmart has an agreement to be used as a FEMA camp in case of martial law. And part of this belief might come from the fact that Walmart has long been a supplier to different federal agencies, with everything from general supplies to emergency relief services. And since they do that, then it's possible that they've agreed to do much more, in exchange for tax breaks. There's also allegedly all these weird sightings at Walmart of individuals who wander the aisles, or alleged sightings of people moving around in the store way past closing hours. This one is one of the more ridiculous ones. Did the Soviet Union win the Cold War? That's what this next conspiracy, called the Perestroika Deception, claims. Perestroika, for those of you that don't know, was a reform movement in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, and has since become synonymous with Mikhail Gorbachev. It was basically an attempt to restructure the entire economy of the Soviet Union to end the stagnation that had occurred since the early 1980s, and basically, the goal was not to end the communist planned economy, but instead to add some free market reforms that would help the economy become more efficient. But it didn't work, and actually destabilized the economy even more, and it didn't take long until the Soviet Union collapsed a few years later. Or, that's what history tells us. But according to this theory, perestroika was never a genuine attempt at going away from communism. It was more of a way to reorganize it and a way to spread it much easier, and in a much less obvious way. So basically, perestroika was really just a smokescreen to make it look like communism was getting weak, when all it was really doing was adapting to modern times, and they found that it made more sense to fight capitalist nations, not through war, but in covert ways, behind the scenes, by infiltrating capitalist societies and spreading communist ideologies. This, of course, totally tricked the West, who believed the Soviet Union's collapse was the end of communism in the country, and did not realize it until it was too late, when it basically just morphed into a more subtle form of what we see today. And not only did it survive, it is now thriving in Western societies where people are being manipulated online every day, and it gets more and more alarming by the day. Almost every corner of the internet is now infested with Kremlin bots, 4chan especially, that are not only promoting communism as a viable alternative, but also creating fiction in all these Western countries, many times riling up citizens against their fellow neighbor. Edward Snowden is a name I'm sure you remember. He came to prominence in 2013 when working as a contractor for the NSA, who became burdened with the knowledge that America was spying on its own citizens. After trying to bring up ethical concerns through proper channels, he was promptly ignored. Finally, he had enough and flew to Hong Kong, where he did a series of interviews with journalists, where he showed them thousands of classified NSA documents which showed the various ways Americans were being spied on. Within a few weeks, he was charged with espionage, and the US revoked his passport so he could no longer run. However, he would fly into Russia 2 days later when they were more than happy to let him in and have asylum, and he would eventually become a citizen. And to this day, many citizens see him as a hero for his actions. But what if he is not a hero at all, and actually was doing exactly what the NSA wanted? That brings us to the theory that the Edward Snowden disclosures were a psyops. That's right, it was all planned by the NSA and Snowden, who was an agent that was not only capable of pulling it off, but was willing to do it for national security purposes. And what do I mean by this? Well, we have to go back to Snowden's appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast. If you've seen that episode, you may remember a couple of things that Snowden discussed, like his interest in popular conspiracy theories, and how he had all this info available to him to search through. And so he did, first looking for files on alien contact, or what the heck the government was doing with chemtrails. And Snowden's answer was disappointing. He would tell Rogan that none of it existed, or at least he, using all the tools at his disposal, never found one bit of information that showed that aliens had visited Earth, nor was there any proof for any of the other popular conspiracies, which leads to speculation that this was not a genuine whistleblowing act, and instead a carefully orchestrated move by the NSA. They thought by releasing highly controversial information, like spying on its own citizens, the NSA could distance itself from real classified activities like aliens, or their studies of geoengineering, which involves chemtrails. And since Snowden, through the use of media, becomes sort of a folk hero, his credibility was untouchable. No one even really tried to call him out on any of his claims, so when he said there was no alien contact, it probably caused a lot of people to stop calling for alien disclosure. But that's not even the biggest clue that this was a psyops. That would be, despite everyone getting so upset with the government spying disclosure, nothing changed. The NSA still basically does what it wants without interference, and no one seems to care anymore. Likewise, if you recall in part 1 of this series, we actually discussed the possibility that Joe Rogan himself was working for the government as a disinfo agent, so it would make perfect sense for him to have Snowden on to proudly say, "There are no aliens, quit asking." But there's other odd things about Snowden's revelations. If he had all this access to the most sensitive files, why, instead of saying, "There are no aliens," did he not explain what was going on at Area 51? Why didn't he address rumors that have swirled around Project Blue Book? Instead of shooting down chemtrails, why didn't he talk about America's advanced weather manipulation programs? It seems like all his whistleblowing was pretty limited and was more of a way to use reverse psychology in hopes of dividing the conspiracy community up. And of course, the best way to hide something is to just discredit the people that are saying it, and it seems that could have been the whole goal here. How about a space conspiracy? If you're like me, you have probably never heard of the Boötes Void. It's also known as the Great Nothing or Great Void, and it's basically this huge area of space where hardly anything exists. It spans an area of 330 million light years across, but only has around 60 galaxies. And if you go by the rest of the explored solar system, then mathematically it doesn't make sense, because an area of space this wide should have at least 2,000 galaxies. It's one of the largest voids in the visible universe. Scientists have theories on how this void came to be, but no one's for sure, which has left the door open for conspiracy theorists. It's actually long been postulated by those of the fringe-minded that this void in space is because some alien civilization came in and harvested entire galaxies for their energy and resources, or whatever reason. Sorta like Brainiac from Superman. But these aliens come in and build Dyson sphere structures to take the energy, which makes them invisible to our telescopes. It's also possible they just went into these galaxies, dismantled them, and took the raw materials and left. This theory has been around for a while, but it's mainly discussed by the more science-minded conspiracy theorists. But of course, we like to look at the lesser-known theories, and this one suggests that it has nothing to do with aliens harvesting resources from the Great Void. Instead, this void exists because it's what some alien civilization wants us to see. Let me explain. If there are really advanced civilizations out in the universe, it's completely possible they don't want mankind to have any evidence of their existence. So with their advanced technology, they begin to feed false data to our telescopes, satellites, and space probes via hacking or some kind of manipulation of signals. So the data we get about space might be completely artificial. What our deep space probes are sending back could just be full of false data, meaning Earth is basically kind of stuck in our own area with no real knowledge of the universe, like we're in a zoo for these other civilizations to come by and look at sometimes, but we're never really allowed to see out. This would go on to explain why we have never had any conclusive signals from intelligent life. Take SETI for example, which has long searched for any kind of signals from space which might indicate life being out there, and they have never found a thing. Of course, that leaves the big question: why go through all that effort to hide from a civilization that you're so much further ahead of? June 27th, 1967. The United States Coast Guard, patrolling off the coast of Florida, would come across a very peculiar find. There it was, floating a little offshore, an 18-inch square crate. When they got closer and pulled it in, the crate was marked, "Made in the USSR," and was addressed to the Institute of Mineral Resources of Cuba. The box was estimated to have been floating for about 2 months, which investigators came to that conclusion after seeing the amount of barnacles all over the crate. This obviously put not only the Coast Guard on alert, but the entire US government. What had they found? Was this box full of Cold War secrets? Not that exciting. Actually, when they opened it, all they found was heavy yellow rubber balloons with a black rubber stopper on the ends. They were fully inflated and about the size of a cantaloupe. The Coast Guard was stumped and assumed some type of deadly gas was in the balloons. But when they investigated that, they found out that, yeah, it was just air. But the biggest clue was what the stamps on the box read, which indicated whatever was carried weighed around 110 pounds. This was critical because the crate with the balloons only weighed 30 pounds, leaving the mystery: what was in the crate with the balloons? And how did it get in the ocean? Did it fall off the ship? Doubtful, since nothing of value was in it, and it's more than likely that the Cubans, upon receiving the item, just threw the crate overboard. However, that doesn't explain the balloons. At first, you may think it was for packaging, but why would they put a stopper at the ends of them? That makes it seem more like it was meant to act as buoys, and basically ever since, people have brought up all types of conspiracy theories to explain what it was that was actually found. One of the earliest was that the balloons, which are so low-tech and unassuming, could have been perfect for carrying hidden microfilm, or maybe even some kind of encoded writing invisible to the naked eye. And it's possible a UA-sensitive ink or some kind of other technology might have been used to transmit secret messages between Cuban agents, or perhaps even sleeper agents in the US. Others suggested the Russians were testing an experimental delivery system, which could later be used to disperse biological or chemical weapons. And it's just possible the Russians intentionally dropped it off the coast of Florida, hoping it was discovered, just to see how the Florida population would react to something so mundane as finding balloons. While another line of thought was the whole thing was a Russian psyop to make the US government even more paranoid and potentially confused by what Russia was really up to, meaning it was nothing more than a crate with yellow balloons just to worry the US. But those are all old conspiracies that basically popped up right after the balloon's discovery. We are going to look at a different take on this weird conspiracy called experimentation innocuity, which suggests that the yellow balloons case was a government experiment hidden in plain sight. Basically, the balloons, which seem so innocent and mundane, are perfect for certain tests or projects the government wants to pull off, because in the chance that it is discovered, everyone will just think, well, it's balloons, that's harmless. Like most citizens at the time that heard about the balloons being found. They completely ignored it or made jokes about it because it's balloons, who cares? But what if these balloons were carrying tiny sensors or some kind of other tiny device that would allow them to collect data about how people react to something so strange as finding the balloons in the first place? Heck, maybe the devices could even try to alter your behavior. I mean, during the Cold War, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that governments were pulling psychological experiments like that. But that's where the theory gets crazier. The balloons are just one facet on this one, because if the theory is true, then that means there's tons of other little things you see in your everyday life that could be part of a government experiment. You sit down for a bite to eat on lunch and notice a gum wrapper sitting on the table next to you. But is that a normal wrapper? Or could it be concealing some tiny electronic that could be used to listen to your conversations? Or maybe it was just left out to mark a certain location for some other agent. Or maybe it's just a gum wrapper. See, that's the point of this one. It's all about hiding the extraordinary within the ordinary. Or in more simple terms, nothing is ever as it seems. In November of 2024, former host of The Tonight Show, 74-year-old Jay Leno, would become the focal point for this very bizarre conspiracy, which involved an injury he had received. That's right, upon going out into public, Jay would be seen wearing an eye patch covering a black eye, although unable to hide the entire left side of his face, which had a huge bruise covering it. According to Jay, on November 16th, while in Pittsburgh for a show performance, he got a hotel, and unfortunately, he had been dropped off and did not have a vehicle. So when he got hungry and began looking around for places to eat, he seen the closest location was 1.5 miles away, and instead of calling for an Uber for such a short ride, he figured he could just make the brisk walk over and get his meal. However, to get there, he had to walk down this big hill, where the 74-year-old lost his footing, tumbled down the hill, and hit his face on a rock. Very plausible story, but not to conspiracy theorists, who immediately suggested many darker alternatives. Some were not that unreasonable, like some who theorized that Jay owed the mob a lot of money over gambling debt, and someone was sending him a message. But we're going to talk about the really weird one, the Panda Eyes conspiracy, which states that Jay's black eye indicates some kind of secret ritual, initiation, or punishment by a secret society, usually the Illuminati. The name Panda Eyes comes from the appearance of the dark discoloration around the eyes that celebrities, politicians, or any famous person who suddenly appears in public with the unexplained facial injury. Sometimes, it's thought that the person somehow double-crossed the Illuminati or embarrass them, and someone is sent to deal out the punishment. Or sometimes, it might just be done to test the person's loyalty or as an initiation to get in. Although, one has to wonder why it took 74-year-old Jay Leno so long to become a member. Others believe that the black eye is instead a badge of honor that celebrates that person's movement into a higher rank within the organization, which could be a little bit more believable in Jay's case, because it suggests he had possibly moved up to the highest tier of the Illuminati. But as we mentioned, Jay is not the only celebrity to have appeared like this. Maybe the most scary was when Pope Francis was seen with a black eye in 2017, which he claimed happened after the driver of the Popemobile suddenly stopped and caused the Pope to bash his head into the plexiglass shield guarding him. If the Panda Eyes theory is true, that would mean that the Illuminati, or whatever secret group, is also controlling the Pope, and possibly the entire Catholic Church. Of course, it's just as possible these are black eyes that came from accidents.